Crazy mistakes that changed history forever. The Titanic dismissing iceberg warnings. In the evening hours of April 14th, 1912, the Titanic was just reaching the midpoint on its voyage to New York City. And as we all know, the Titanic never made it. All of this is relatively common knowledge. But what's not commonly known is the fact that these icebergs were not out of nowhere. The Titanic's crew specifically received warnings from other ships in the area about a potentially dangerous iceberg field, and the Titanic not only received but acknowledged these warnings. However, the tragedy still happened. And the reason why is likely one of the biggest mistakes ever in maritime history. Now, let's zoom in on exactly what led up to this fateful event and the mistakes that unfortunately caused it. One thing that's important to note is that the Titanic was not alone on its voyage. It wasn't necessarily surrounded by ships, but in a roughly 250-mile radius, there was 9 other ships making the same voyage across the North Atlantic, heading in both directions, both east and west, in what is known as shipping lanes, basically imaginary roads in the water. Some of the ships that were slightly further ahead than the Titanic all made comments about a large ice field that was directly in the path of these ships, meaning that action was required to actively avoid this ice field. These communications between ships were known as the Marconi messages, and these messages gave explicit information about where these icebergs were, how large they were, and how dangerous they could potentially be to a ship. In the captain's own journal that was kept in the black box on the ship, he even wrote down that he had been seeing extremely large icebergs and that the conditions outside were ideal for ice formations. Although with all of these notes being made, he had one note that he underlined in his journal that stated, quote, "no reduction of speed," meaning that even though the captain was fully aware of all of the dangerous icebergs and potential more to come, he didn't seem very concerned about them. And what's even more interesting is the plethora of theories on why the captain never slowed down, which is an obvious question that most would ask. If you know that you're heading towards a dangerous area in the water, why would you maintain such a high speed? And one of the most popular theories is that the person running the White Star Company, the company that owned the Titanic and other ships, intentionally withheld information from the captain to ensure that he didn't slow down speeds so that the Titanic would make it to New York on time, maintaining the company's reputation. However, I'm sure you can already see the irony. Regardless, at 11:39 p.m., the captain goes to bed and leaves his senior officers in place. And only shortly after that, one of the lookouts in the crow's nest spots a giant iceberg directly ahead. And by the time it's spotted, it's already almost too late. The ship is moving too fast, and while the ship did in its last moments slightly steer out of the way of the iceberg, this turn could have actually made things worse. Because now, the ship wasn't heading directly into the iceberg was going to be scraping along the side of the Titanic, essentially ripping it apart. Over 1,500 people lost their lives, and the Titanic became a legend of tragedy. This isn't to say that if the Titanic had reduced its speed, it would have guaranteed not to sink. Although many experts believe that maintaining a high speed with such dangerous conditions approaching was definitely an oversight and a fatal mistake that likely caused the Titanic to sink. The dropped helmet downfall. In 547 BC, there was a city known as Sardis. And during this time, the city of Sardis was under the rule of Croesus, the king of Lydia. The kingdom of Lydia, for context, would be in modern-day Turkey. Now, what's interesting about Sardis is that this city is extremely well fortified, both geographically and architecturally. And what I mean by this is that Sardis wasn't only just a city with huge castle walls, it also was built on top of very steep mountains, meaning that this was one place that you would not want to try to siege simply because of how unoptimal this place would be to attack. Croesus would have such an advantage when it comes to high ground invisibility and knowledge of how to navigate the landscape. Anybody who would try to attack and siege the city would essentially have a death wish. That was until Cyrus the Great entered the chat. Cyrus the Great heard that Croesus was actually busy doing some other battles that he wasn't doing too well in, and because Croesus wasn't doing so well, he disbanded his troops and was basically taking the winter off to try to refight in the next spring. But when Cyrus the Great got word that Croesus was disbanding his troops, he figured now would be the perfect time to try to siege this impossible city. And that's what happened. Cyrus and his troops showed up on the ground outside of Sardis, and Croesus, kind of shocked that they were even there, quickly gathered all of the troops that were within the castle walls, and a battle ensued. Interestingly, Cyrus actually won this initial battle outside of the castle walls. However, Sardis was still not sieged, and was still believed to be unsiegeable. And Croesus himself was still confident they would never get inside the city walls, and this confidence wasn't unfounded. There was literally ancient prophecies stating that this well-fortified city could never be captured. That was until one tiny mistake was made. One motivated soldier in Cyrus's army was taking a walk around the mountain when he found himself near the back of this massive mountain, simply looking up and watching the city, when he noticed one of the Lydian guards at the top of the hill. The Lydian guard didn't notice the soldier, so the soldier just watched him to see if there was anything he could learn. And what happened definitely changed history. The Lydian soldier, not paying attention, accidentally dropped his helmet down the hill. And because he didn't know that he was being watched, he went ahead and retrieved his helmet. But as he retrieved his helmet, he inadvertently exposed the only vulnerable position of the entire city. And after this Persian soldier watched this Lydian soldier go from the city of Sardis down to gather his helmet and then back up almost effortlessly, he knew he had some crazy intel. And later that night, that same Persian soldier went back to the same location, tried to retrace the steps of that Lydian soldier that he saw, which he was able to do successfully. He shared this information with his army, and the rest is history. With their golden ticket into Sardis, Cyrus and his men laid siege to Sardis for 14 days, eventually capturing it. And it was with this siege that the Persian Empire grew stronger. And I guess it goes to show, no matter how fortified you think you are, never expose your back door. Hitler sleeping in on D-Day. June 6, 1944 signifies a massive win for the Allied powers in World War II. American, Canadian, and British forces were able to storm the beaches of Nazi-occupied Normandy in France, giving them the leverage to truly sink their teeth into the Axis powers, allowing them to ultimately win the war. And while we're all grateful that things worked out this way, why did it work out this way? At the time, there was a very real and dystopian possibility that the Nazis could have won D-Day and history would have looked a lot different. But that's a bit off topic. The biggest contributors to the Allied powers' success on D-Day comes down to two major points. One being the Allied powers' general clever strategy, and the second being a general lack of planning and communication in preparation for this attack. And when I say in preparation, I mean the Germans knew that the coast of France was susceptible to an attack, and they were at this point expecting it. But the only problem was they didn't know where the Allied forces would attack, and this was the major problem internally. Hitler and other high-ranking officials believed that Pas de Calais is undoubtedly where the Allied powers would try to land. However, other officials believed that Normandy was also a possibility. There was no general consensus on where they could have landed, and Hitler's solution was to spread out troops all across France's shoreline. And while this seems logical, it had a major flaw. No one individual location was extremely well equipped, and when the invasion did happen, it would take some time for a counterattack from the Germans to gather all of the other troops from the shoreline to the one area where the actual battle was happening. This mismanagement alone could be considered its own historical mistake, but it doesn't end there. Due to some previous red herrings that the Allied powers threw, specifically staging a false invasion on Pas de Calais, when the actual attack on D-Day happened, German troops weren't sure if this was a real invasion or simply another distraction, which leads us to the situation I mentioned earlier. On the morning of D-Day, when the attacks started happening, Hitler was fast asleep. It's reported that he was up late the night before watching newsreels and fell asleep around 3 a.m. Now, interestingly, because the high-ranking officials did not believe that the attack on Normandy was not the major attack that they saw coming, they decided that it was not worth waking up Hitler, and they decided they would allow him to wake up and then they would figure out what to do next. However, that window from the storming of Normandy to when Hitler woke up and began to make counterattack plans, significant progress was already made by the Allied powers, leaving Germany in a really bad spot. Now, this doesn't mean that the Allied powers had no resistance. The Allied powers had to fight against extreme resistance and saw countless tragedies during this battle, with one of the biggest reasons being the Germans fought like hell because it was very well known among the high-ranking Nazi officials that if the Allied powers were able to successfully storm the beaches, they would have at that point won the war. So even though the Germans were unprepared for this battle, they still fought as hard as they could because they knew that this battle would likely be one of the last, which wasn't far from the truth. Hitler spread his troops way too thin, tried to keep too tight of a grip on the entire operation. His high-ranking officials didn't take the attack on Normandy seriously and didn't wake him up, and for that reason, Hitler slept in until 10 a.m., 3.5 hours after the massive naval and aerial bombardment started to take place on French soil. And I think it's important to note that while this was a mistake on Hitler's part, this mistake gave the Allied powers a lot of leverage, and the impact this had on history was net positive, so sometimes mistakes can be good, if they're made by bad people. This video in total could have been 10 hours long with all of the insane historical mistakes, and while I can't make a 10-hour long video, I can make this video, and if you guys really like this video, I can make a part 2. So if you guys are interested in seeing even more, please let me know in the comments below by either commenting part 2 or even just leaving a like. Your guys' support always means a lot, and if you're new here, feel free to subscribe. We post every Friday. Let's move on. The Trojan horse. Right off the bat, I'm going to say there's definitely a lot of skepticism surrounding the entire Trojan War situation. At this point, archaeologists and historians are pretty certain that the Trojan Wars, happened, although there is a lot of legend and myth surrounding the entire situation, specifically demigods and divine intervention and things like that. Another very popular possible myth is the Trojan horse situation. And while it's not exactly proven to be true, it also hasn't been proven to be false either. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to tell the story as there is real historical roots, and the story is still rather compelling and interesting. So as the story goes, during the Trojan Wars, the Greeks came up with a very interesting method of attacking the city of Troy from the inside. That method involved a large wooden horse. Now, some versions of the story claim that the Greeks actually gifted the horse to the Trojans as a peace offering, saying, hey, we don't want any problems. Here you go. You can have this horse. But another version of the story that I think is more plausible, assuming the situation is real, is the fact that the Greeks were extremely deceptive with how they delivered this horse. Some versions of the story claim that the Greeks intentionally left the horse near the city of Troy and made it seem like they spent so much time on it, but then at the last minute abandoned it for mysterious reasons. Information was given to the Trojan authorities saying that the Greeks were building this horse as an offering to the god Athena. And because the Trojans didn't want the Greeks to have any sort of divine superiority, they decided they would steal the horse and offer it to Athena themselves, then getting the preference from the gods. Both stories are a bit out there, but I do believe that them stealing it for their own gain is a lot more likely than them accepting a massive questionable gift from their enemy at the time. Regardless, once this wooden horse was within Trojan walls, the hidden Greek soldiers inside waited until nightfall, slowly and quietly exited the horse and began killing the guards. They then opened the gates into Troy and allowed all hell to break loose. And while I'm keeping this one a bit short simply because there is very murky facts associated with it, the city of Troy did exist, it did fall, and the Trojan Wars were a thing, the exact details on the ongoings are interesting. And while the story of the Trojan horse is more or less at this point considered legend with possible historical roots, it's definitely not confirmed. And while it's hard to say that that situation that maybe didn't happen changed history forever, I still think it was worth mentioning. Because whether the situation happened or not, we still learned a valuable lesson from this legend. The Bay of Pigs time zone confusion. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a failed military operation by the USA on Cuba during a time when Fidel Castro was gaining a lot of power within Cuba and getting really friendly with the Soviet Union, and America did not like it whatsoever. The US president at the time, John F. Kennedy, decided that his best course of action was to secretly try to overthrow Fidel Castro, but in a way that left him some plausible deniability. And that alone is kind of a mistake on his part, because him being half in, half out definitely was a major contributing factor in the Bay of Pigs invasion failing, but it's not what I want to focus on this point, because I think there's an even smaller and even more hilarious mistake that took place during this already failed operation. There's a lot of nuance to the situation, but for a bit of additional context, when John F. Kennedy was running for president, he was running on a very anti-communist sentiment. And after he got into power, when there was a neighbor south of the American border who was very communist, he had to do something about it. But there was an issue. Cuba was getting close with the Soviet Union, and this was during the Cold War, so Kennedy did not want to rub the Soviet Union the wrong way. But at the same time, if Kennedy did nothing about Cuba just becoming this communist society, he was going to look passive to the people that voted for him to help eliminate communism, which is why he decided to be a bit sneaky. And by sneaky, I mean he literally assembled an army specifically of Cuban refugees in America, and he even went as far as painting an American B-26 bomber to look like it was Cuban, so that when it was bombing Cuba, it wouldn't look like America was involved whatsoever. Although the bomber was almost instantly known to be American as soon as it was seen flying over Cuba, which is kind of what exposed the entire situation, but we'll get into that. The ultimate goal from the American perspective was to simply invade the Bay of Pigs, build a small base in that area, and through the successful landing of troops in the Bay of Pigs, through the power of that army and through the power of locals now feeling emboldened to rise up against this communist government, they would easily be able to overthrow the government, kill Castro, and have a new capitalistic society installed in Cuba once again. But there was a few problems. One, the American forces, more specifically Cuban refugees fighting on America's behalf, did not have proper support for reasons we'll get into. And also, the government actually underestimated how popular Fidel Castro actually was. The invasion started with a bombing raid from American planes on Cuban soil, and then the following day, troops were on the ground in the Bay of Pigs. However, at this time, the plan was relatively exposed due to that plane being poorly disguised and seen early. And because John F. Kennedy didn't want to catch the blame for having this entire invasion, he almost instantly withdrew all air support that was deemed crucial to the mission, basically leaving the troops that he had just sent there to die. He withdrew the support to have plausible deniability that, oh, I didn't want that going on, but in reality, that's exactly what he wanted, and all he did was just ensure the failure of that invasion. And due to the lack of support, the invasion only lasted 3 days, and the Cuban forces from America were either killed or surrendered. Now, this is where time zones actually come into play, because during this situation, as a last-ditch effort, a bombing plane was actually sent from Nicaragua to help provide support. However, Nicaragua is in a different time zone than Cuba, but the bomber jet pilots did not take this into consideration. So when there was plans for the bomber jet pilot to be accompanied by fighter jets over Cuba, there was an hour difference between their plans, meaning in this last-ditch effort, this bomber plane was unescorted by fighter jets, leaving it extremely vulnerable, cutting that plan short too when the time actually came. And this sort of last-ditch effort failure was the nail in the coffin. And the backlash because of this failed Bay of Pigs invasion was the following. One, Fidel Castro only grew stronger as a leader because in the eyes of the Cuban citizens, he had just defended the country from an attack from the American government, the biggest military machine in the world, making him look like an extremely strong and powerful leader. And besides making the citizens favor Fidel even more, this made Fidel favor the Soviet Union even more, which is why this situation was basically the catalyst for the Cuban Missile Crisis, which only happened a year later. So yeah, although there was military fighter pilots that were not able to remember time zones between Nicaragua and Cuba, leaving a bomber plane completely vulnerable, that's more or less of an oversight in this entire operation that was ultimately a huge failure for the American government. And this definitely had very serious historical repercussions. NASA ignoring Challenger warnings. In 1986, the space shuttle known as Challenger was set for an amazing mission. The shuttle had 7 bright astronauts on board, and this crew was ready for takeoff. And on 11:39 a.m., just off the coast of Florida, the Challenger spaceship took off. Things looked relatively normal until just over a minute after the launch took place, the situation turned catastrophic. The space shuttle broke apart and disintegrated 14 kilometers in the air, leaving all 7 of the astronauts dead. This failed launch was a national tragedy. However, it could have been easily prevented. You see, after this devastating launch, a huge investigation was underway, and what they eventually ended up finding was that the cause of this entire explosion was the shuttle's rubber O-rings, which may seem like a non-crucial component, but in this case, these components were extremely crucial because they actually sealed the rocket boosters. And if you don't have sealed boosters, then hot gases can escape, and having hot gases right next to massive fuel tanks is a recipe for disaster. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. Now, obviously, hindsight is always 20/20, and if they had that information previously, they could have prevented it, but they did have this information. Months before the launch, one of the engineers on the project, Roger Boyce-Jolly, along with other engineers, both repeatedly warned NASA that the O-rings on the boosters may not function properly in low temperatures. But these weren't just verbal warnings. Boyce-Jolly even submitted a formal, detailed memo emphasizing the serious concerns and the potential deadly consequences. And even though numerous engineers warned about a potential fatal flaw with this launch, NASA ignored all of the warnings. Obviously, the mistake in question. But it doesn't end there, because once it was clear that NASA was not taking these concerns seriously, a group of individuals formed, making it their mission to stop this launch for the safety of the astronauts, although they didn't have the authority or support to actually prevent the launch from happening. And despite NASA being aware of the potential flaw, the launch still took place, and the world lost 7 astronauts, and NASA lost a lot of trust. One of the most devastating parts of this entire situation is that NASA knew that the specific failure of this O-ring would only be triggered by a cold environment. And even with this information, they decided to launch the rocket in January, which in Florida isn't typically that cold, but this day that it launched was particularly cold, and even still, with both of these factors, they still continued to launch on that day. When doing research for this section, I actually watched a video by Free Documentary on YouTube that has a full 50-minute breakdown on why this entire situation happened. And while I totally recommend going and watching that, and I'll even link that in the description, I wanted to quickly highlight the comments, because there was a lot of people commenting on this video that had personal experiences that were honestly heartbreaking. One of which comes from Leslie, where she states that her father was actually one of the engineers who tried to stop the launch. However, because him and other engineers weren't able to prevent the launch, when the eventual launch ended up happening and taking the lives of 7 astronauts, her father, as well as other engineers, became severely depressed simply because they felt they had failed the astronauts and even had a hand in killing the astronauts because they were unable to prevent the launch, which is truly terrible. Obviously, they were not responsible for the deaths whatsoever and actively tried to prevent them. However, NASA was unwilling to take their advice. The Chernobyl disaster. The story of Chernobyl is one that we are all likely familiar with at this point in time, but it cannot be understated how much of an impact this tragedy had not only on innocent civilians, but also on the outlook on nuclear power for decades to come. Ironically, the Chernobyl disaster took place once again in 1986. Not a good year for global tragedies. And while this situation was different, it did have some overlap, specifically with the fact that this disaster too could have been easily avoided with simple safety regulations. The Chernobyl power plant was one of the most advanced in the entire country. Specifically, Reactor 4, the reactor that exploded, was the newest, only being made 3 years before the disaster. On the day of the tragedy, a safety test was supposed to be carried out by the day crew during their shift. However, they did not carry out the safety test during the day, so the night crew had to take over. This doesn't seem like a big deal until you understand that the night crew was not nearly as trained as the day crew, and they were not supposed to be doing safety tests. However, in this case, they did. They had minimal time to actually prepare for how this was going to happen, or how to properly deal with any sort of adversity in case something went wrong. And on top of their poor training and lack of experience, the Soviet Union was also very secretive about this technology in general. So even the people that were experienced in the situation were not fully in the loop with how everything was even operating to begin with. However, the night crew went about doing the safety test, and this safety test is exactly what resulted in the explosion of Reactor 4. Now, this isn't to say that this was the only issue that took place within Chernobyl, because at this point it is well known that Chernobyl had serious design flaws that were essentially destined to fail. And similar to the situation we just talked about, there was people working within the Chernobyl power plant that had reservations about the entire system that they were even using. Although, once again, their warnings were ignored. One of the biggest design flaws was that Chernobyl actually had a positive feedback loop when things were not going good. In most other nuclear power plants, if things were to get out of control, there would be a negative feedback loop, meaning that even without any human intervention, if the power plant was out of control, the reactor would by default cool down, produce less energy, and eventually fizzle out. However, with Chernobyl, things were designed with a positive feedback loop, meaning that if things got out of control, the generators would only get hotter and hotter, creating more and more power, which would only then get hotter and create more power until the eventual explosion. On the day of the actual explosion, only 2 people died. Although in the 2 weeks following the explosion, 28 firefighters who were working on putting out the actual fire that took place in combination with the exploded reactor died due to radiation sickness. That's over 10% of the firefighters that helped put out the initial fire. Immediately after the explosion, 115,000 people were evacuated from a 30-kilometer radius, and 8 tons of radiation were shot into the atmosphere, which eventually made its way over almost all of Europe. And after everything was said and done, the toxicity of the radioactive cloud that came out of this explosion was equivalent to 400 Hiroshima atomic bomb explosions. Not in terms of actual explosive disaster, but specifically in terms of radioactivity. As of right now, this entire situation cost over $700 billion US, and today the cleanup is still going on, and the total cleanup for the Chernobyl situation is expected to be completed in 2065, almost 80 years after the initial explosion. The accidental discovery of penicillin. Yep, you've heard me right. This video has been relatively dark, so I figured for the last entry on this list, I'd leave it on a positive note. In 1928, Scottish physician Alexander Fleming was studying a specific bacterial culture, and during this study, he decided that he would leave his culture plate out on his workbench over the weekend. That's not so odd, but what was odd was the fact that when he came back on Monday morning to check on this bacteria culture he had left out, he had noticed that there was mold growing on the plate. Now, initially, having mold growing on your bacteria culture means that the sample is just worthless and you have to start again. But he noticed something interesting. The bacteria that was surrounding this mold was destroyed and didn't exist anymore. And this gave him an interesting idea. He began to continue tests to see how powerful this mold could be when it comes to neutralizing and destroying bacteria. And it was this observation that eventually led to penicillin, the world's true first antibiotic, which at this point has saved millions upon millions of lives. The mold is known as Penicillium notatum, and that little bit of mold just magically appearing on Fleming's culture plate undoubtedly had a massive impact on history forever. And just goes to show, sometimes something you perceive as negative actually ends up being the best thing that could possibly happen to you. And just imagine what could have happened if Alexander wasn't feeling so inquisitive this day and just decided to angrily throw out this culture plate because it wasn't to his liking and had mold on it. History is truly wild. Dumb rules that exist for smart reasons. The sliced bread ban. I know, shocking, right? I didn't believe it when I heard it either. Mainly because every time you hear about sliced bread, it's always within the context of how amazing it is. Which I find a bit ironic because it seems like most people hold the invention of sliced bread in higher regard than the invention of actual bread. You know, the food that literally sustained humanity for generations. That's besides the point. When sliced bread came out, it was one of the biggest inventions of all time, at least according to catchphrases. But did you know that there was a period of history, albeit brief, where the United States government literally banned sliced bread? Let me explain. The entire sliced bread saga dates all the way back to 1912, when a man named Otto Frederick Rohwedder created the first prototype for an automatic bread slicer. Although this prototype would stay exactly that for a few years. And unfortunately, only 5 years later in 1917, a fire at his warehouse not only destroyed his bread slicing prototype, but also destroyed all of the documentation around it. That includes the blueprints, the spare parts, the other versions he was working on. Literally everything associated with this initial prototype was destroyed in a fire, delaying one of the best inventions of all time by another decade. 11 years later in 1928, with the help from the Chillicothe Baking Company in Missouri, Otto's invention was finally able to get picked up off the ground. Not only were they beginning to use this prototype machine, but they also claimed, quote, this was the greatest step forward in the baking industry since bread was wrapped. Meaning that even back then, nearly 100 years ago, people were so enthusiastic about bread innovation. The start of the sliced bread craze was slow, but after a few years and many large-scale marketing campaigns, sliced bread was a household staple by the 1930s. And by the late 1930s, it was a necessity in every household. And it was also around this time when Wonder Bread was invented. You know, the bread that literally looks like printer paper. But of course, this video isn't about the history of bread, and we've already discussed what the dumb rule was, so what was the smart reason for this weird ban? And without giving too much away, let me just say that this ban took place in 1943, a time when World War II was in full effect, and the United States of America was heavily involved. It shouldn't come as a surprise that during World War II, rations were a way of life to ensure that there was proper availability and supply chain to supply our troops overseas with everything they needed to, in this case, kick some Nazi butt. But these rations came with a price. Besides the inherent restricted lifestyle experienced by everyday Americans, there was also frequent unexpected shortages. For example, sugar or rubber tires running in short supply. And it was because of this that the American government was becoming more and more more anxious about not having the proper supplies or supply chain to fund one of the most important wars of all time. And it was actually this anxiety that led to the banning of sliced bread. On January 18th, 1943, Claude R. Wickard, the head of the War Foods Administration, declared that selling sliced bread was illegal. His rationale for this was because sliced bread required thicker wrapping paper to stay fresh, and he argued with the banning of sliced bread that more wax paper would be available, once again, for the troops overseas. But not only would we save wax paper, but we would save steel that would otherwise go to the production of new bread slicing machines. Now, admittedly, I can kind of see both sides of this, because A, this definitely sucks and seems extremely arbitrary, and I feel like there's other corners to be cut. But at the same end, when you are literally fighting in World War II, I think there is no better expression than desperate times call for desperate measures. But with that being said, this ban on sliced bread was definitely not met with acceptance, and almost instantly there was public outrage, specifically among housewives in America, who at this time in many cases were expected to be not only single parents, homemakers, and also full-time factory workers to ensure that the labor force didn't collapse. When these women learned that one of their newest luxuries was going to be taken away from them, they were understandably upset. And there was even a famous quote that was written in a letter to the New York Times only a week after the ban took place. The quote goes as such: "I should like to let you know how important sliced bread is to the morale and the saneness of a household. My husband and 4 children are all in a rush during and after breakfast. Without ready sliced bread, I must do the slicing for toast, 2 pieces each. That's 10. For their lunches, I must cut by hand at least 20 slices for 2 sandwiches apiece. Afterwards, I make my own toast. That's 22 slices of bread to cut in a hurry." That is only one example from one woman, but it paints a picture of how the American people were feeling at this time, coupling not only the annoyance of sliced bread being banned, but also all of the other rations taking place and a literal world war happening overseas. And it was because of all of the public outcry that only 3 months after the ban was introduced, the ban was appealed and sliced bread was once again legal in the United States. I wanted to add this entry very first on the list because I thought the concept of sliced bread being banned was so funny. And while I think we can all agree that this was definitely a dumb rule, I would hope that at least most of us could agree that there was definitely a good reason for this rule, specifically doing everything humanly possible to ensure that the Americans and the Allies destroy one of the most evil regimes to ever exist. But let's keep moving. The bear wrestling ban. This rule is dumb not because it seems nonsensical or arbitrary, but because why is this rule even required? Anybody with half a brain and potentially somebody with even a quarter of a brain would understand not to wrestle a bear, right? Well, apparently not people in Alabama in the 1970s. Let me explain. I don't know about you, but when I first read this ban, I instantly envisioned a person walking into the woods, finding a bear randomly, and then wrestling it. But that is not at all what was happening and not what caused this ban whatsoever. The good reason behind this seemingly obvious rule is actually pretty upsetting. During the 1970s, 80s, and even 1990s, bear wrestling was an extremely popular part of circus culture in the United States. And it's also no surprise that these animals are typically not treated well. But potentially one of the poorest treated animals in the entire show was the bear, specifically meant for wrestling. Just for a moment, imagine you're the leader of a circus and you want to have a spectacular bear wrestling act in your circus. How do you go about achieving this safely? Do you A, scrap the idea because this seems unsafe and immoral? B, train a bear to wrestle safely so it can put on a show but also keep your performer safe? Or C, torture, drug, and mutilate the bear until the point that it is so limp and brain dead that literally anybody with a pulse could wrestle it successfully? The answer is obviously C, and that's exactly what happened. Ringleaders knew that they couldn't risk having their talent hurt or killed because that would affect profits. And they also knew that training a bear would take too long. So the porridge that was just right was to literally feed the bear a consistent chemical cocktail to keep them subdued, remove their teeth and claws so they had no opportunity to fight back, and on top of both of these things, consistently torture the bear and keep them malnourished in between shows so that the bear is consistently weak and in a state of fear, meaning that it would rather cower than actually fight back. And one of the most disgusting examples of profiteering off this act was not only having circus staff wrestle these bears for a show, but they would actually sell people in the crowd access to wrestle the bear to look tough. And you just know if that a ringleader felt so confident to have anybody at the circus wrestle their bear, they were messing up the bear so much that there was no way it could hurt anybody. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying these bears should have killed fans or circus employees. I'm just saying they shouldn't have been there in the first place. And that's not even mentioning the extremely questionable methods the circus has used to acquire these bears. And of course, these bear wrestling matches didn't just happen once or twice. They were so prevalent that states had to create their own laws banning them. For example, Alabama made bear wrestling a Class B felony, and this law passed only only in 1996, after a lot of the damage was already done, but I guess better late than never. But interestingly, this law was repealed a decade ago in 2015, not because they wanted to bring back bear wrestling, but because the law was no longer necessary. Circus culture had died down significantly, and bear wrestling was officially a thing of the past. And quite frankly, this law was more or less of a publicity stunt than a traditional piece of legislation. Obviously, this was an enforceable felony, although it was stated that the creation of this law was more or less of an act aimed to support animal welfare and public safety. But yeah, upon a first listen, hearing that wrestling bears is now banned seems redundant and weird. But when you actually learn the story of it, it makes total sense. The dissection debate. This is actually the first rule we're going to discuss that doesn't ban something, it actually allows something. But be warned, this one is pretty morbid. The dumb rule that is in play here is known as the Autonomy Act of 1832, and this rule states that doctors, teachers, and medical students in Britain can legally dissect the bodies of unclaimed dead from workhouses, prisons, and hospitals. Upon a first listen, that not only sounds dumb, but also sounds pretty immoral. Like, just think about it. If somebody dies in prison or in a hospital, and they can't find a living family member, which it probably wasn't easy to find a living family member in 1832, the body was essentially just up for grabs to any doctor, teacher, or medical student. That to me sounds like a slippery slope and a lot of room for a lot of malpractice, to say the least. But believe it or not, this dark and dumb rule actually saved a lot of lives. See, prior to the Autonomy Act, the only way that doctors, teachers, and medical students could dissect a body was if the government gave these individuals the body of an executed criminal. This, for a long time, was standard practice. Somebody breaks the law, they get killed for it, and the body gets essentially donated to science. But issues began to rise when in the 18th and 19th centuries, medical schools needed more and more cadavers to not only teach, but learn more about the human anatomy. And it was with this rise of education and bodily exploration that the supply of these bodies were nowhere near the demand. And unfortunately, this gap in the market led to some very unethical practices. One of the main side hustles that was born out of this shortage was something known as body snatching. And it would go a little something like this. If you were a poor individual living in the slums of London and needed to get a few bucks, an easy way for you to get some quick cash is to take a shovel, wait till it's nighttime, and then go to the nearest graveyard. Dig up any body that was freshly buried and take it to any of the local universities. You know that these universities have money, and you know that they need bodies. So a lot of these universities were, at this point in time, willing to pay cash money for bodies, no questions asked. And it only got worse when people decided that they could optimize on this strategy. And by that, I mean that these body snatchers decided that they would just cut out the middleman. Why go dig up a dead body if you could just make a dead body? And by that, I mean people would literally just kill people and then take the body of their murdered victim directly to the university for cash money. This was more or less of the peak of body snatching. And when this specific story broke and spread across all of Britain, the government knew they had to do something. And it was at that exact moment when the Autonomy Act of 1832 was established. So while it may seem odd that any unclaimed undesirable can just be donated to science against their will, I think the rule makes a lot more sense once you realize that a lack of bodies was not only creating a scientific bottleneck, but was also creating a nationwide trend of grave robbing and eventually murder. This dumb and morbid law actually had a pretty good reason, especially considering the time frame. Like in the 1800s, there was nowhere near the medical standards that there are today. Tiger selfie ban. Yep, we're back to animal bans. But this one is really peculiar. In 2014, the state of New York effectively put a ban on taking selfies with tigers and any other big cats. I think to most of us that sounds pretty dumb, but the reason why they did this makes a lot of sense, and it's actually quite short. The government of New York was getting so many copyright complaints from tigers from people who were taking pictures of them and selling them without giving proceeds to the tigers. And because the government of New York did not want to deal with any more lawsuits from tigers over copyright disputes, they decided to outright ban selfies altogether. That was obviously a total lie, I just made it up. Here's the real scoop. New York didn't necessarily ban taking selfies with tigers. What they did do was specifically ban any member of the public being near any dangerous animal in a circus, zoo, or carnival that is not in a safe and confined cage. And while it may seem like I'm reaching here, the purpose of this ban, keeping people and dangerous animals separated, was specifically inspired by the rise of tiger selfies. During the early 2010s, the dating app Tinder saw a massive surge of men on the platform using pictures of themselves next to tigers as one of their profile photos. And this trend was so prevalent, in fact, that the Wall Street Journal estimates that 1 out of 10 people had a photo with a tiger on their Tinder. Obviously, these men wanted to seem tough and adventurous, but in reality, all they were doing in most cases was contributing to animal exploitation. And when this was all brought to the state of New York, they not only recognized it, but sought to put an end to it. And how they went about it was, of course, the tiger selfie ban. Because no, you can't ban taking a picture with an animal, but you can ban people from being around these dangerous animals. And this ban was pretty effective, considering the New York government knew that all these men that were taking these pictures to look tough knew that they wouldn't look nearly as tough if the tiger was in a cage behind them. And this ban was honestly pretty genius, because these people that were taking pictures with tigers and lions to look tough wouldn't want to have photos of them with a tiger in a cage, because then they wouldn't look tough at all. It would just look like they're taking a selfie at the zoo, completely nullifying the trend, helping mitigate animal exploitation. Similar to the ban of bear wrestling, tigers or lions or jaguars or any big cats that were specifically used for photo ops were not well taken care of in the slightest. A lot of these poor cats were bought young, taken away from their mothers, and for basically all of their life treated poorly and used as a toy and a means to earn profit. When this trend was on the rise in the early 2010s, people were booking all kinds of big cat experiences. Tiger kitten play date, tiger kitten photo op, lion photo op, have a lion at your wedding. Anything you could have imagined, people were buying lions specifically with the purpose of pimping them out at public events to have them look cool. And obviously, if you're bringing a big cat to a public setting, the cat has to be extremely subdued, or in some cases, tortured, malnourished, declawed, defanged, drugged, and the like. And if you ever watched that documentary Tiger King, then you kind of get the idea of the dark business behind the whole big cat picture industry. And just like how Alabama wanted to stop the exploitation of bears, New York sought to stop the exploitation of big cats, which they did with their 2014 tiger selfie ban. A seemingly dumb rule with, in my opinion, a pretty smart plan of attack. The kitty cat cigarette ban. Okay, I swear, this video isn't a Trojan horse for me to get on my vegan soapbox talking about animal cruelty. But coincidentally, there has been a lot of interesting laws surrounding animals, but for the sake of repetition, I'll keep this one brief. Similar to the second law we discussed, this ban isn't dumb because it seems arbitrary, it just seems extremely, well, redundant and nonsensical. The ban I'm specifically referring to is the ban that Illinois placed on handing your pet a nicotine stick. To put it bluntly, in Illinois, it is explicitly stated that it is illegal to, quote, give a lit cigar or cigarette to a cat, dog, or other domestic pet, including ball python. And that's essentially the entire law. You cannot give a lit cigar or cigarette to your cat, dog, domestic pet, or explicitly stated ball python, because of course, everybody's giving a lit cigar to their ball python. It's reported that this law comes from the early 1800s, and by today's standards is relatively outdated, which I would agree with. But I wanted to mention it quickly because it, more than anything, just kind of sounded funny. And also just makes you think, how often was this happening if the state of Illinois had to not only recognize it, but ban it? Obviously, the good reason behind this dumb law is to prevent pets from unintentionally burning themselves or even setting themselves on fire, or potentially even trying to smoke and getting addicted. It was believed that this law was put into place as a general effort to prevent animal cruelty, which is obviously something that's completely reasonable. Although this law is just kind of notable and, in my opinion, hilarious because of how specific it is. The fact that legislators in Illinois had to explicitly exclaim and write with a quill in ink that no lit cigar or cigarette shall be given to any domestic pet, including cats, dogs, hamsters, and ball pythons, to me is hilarious and noteworthy, and we're gonna move on, but I just wanted to share it. And if you were curious, yes, this law is still active today. The no spitting sanction. First and foremost, get your mind out of the gutter. Now let's move on. I think we can all agree that if you see somebody walking down the road just spitting on the sidewalk, it's definitely not polite and pretty gross. But is it something that's worthy of a ban? Well, unless it becomes some sort of national trend, I don't see it as something worthy of government intervention. However, there was a time when the United States government decided that it was in their best interest to ban any form of spitting in any public area. And this wasn't one of those obscure laws with a deeper meaning like some of the other ones we've discussed. No, this was a straightforward law that was not only written and passed, but also had signs placed everywhere reminding individuals and also had strict enforcement. But the question remains, what was the smart reasoning behind this dumb rule? And the answer, as some of you might have guessed, is health related. During 1918, during the last year of World War I, many cities across the United States were dealing with a major Spanish flu pandemic. This pandemic was extremely deadly, and the spread of this disease was seemingly never ending, which is why the US government was pretty desperate to do anything that could potentially stop the spread. During the time of the Spanish flu, over a century ago, health officials believed that diseases like influenza and tuberculosis were spread through saliva droplets. And it was because of this belief that they held that would later essentially be found true, they decided that their best course of action to help prevent the spread would be to minimize the creation of saliva droplets, which meant no spitting, specifically in any public place. Sidewalks, trains, theaters, anywhere. If you were caught spitting, you would be fined and potentially even arrested, which is just crazy to think about now. But during 1918, during the Spanish flu pandemic, I wouldn't want to even be in a public place, let alone spitting in one, making this seemingly dumb rule make a lot more sense with context. And speaking of context, let me give you guys some context about how many of you are actually subscribed. YouTube literally tells me that over 75% of you watching this right now aren't subscribed. So I just wanted to say, if you're enjoying this video or even watch me regularly, consider hitting the subscribe button and being a bro. I post new videos every single Friday, and we are currently on the road to 1 million subscribers. Oh, and if you like this topic of dumb rules with smart reasons, simply leave a like or leave a comment below telling me you want a part 2. I love making the videos that you guys want, so if you want a part 2, let me know and I'd be more than happy to make it. But now, let's get to the final entry on this list. The bubblegum ban. Chances are, if you've heard of any of the dumb rules on this list, it's this one. And that's because this country's gum ban is extremely infamous. And I would actually bet money that you know the country that has this gum ban. And if you guessed Singapore, you'd be right. The whole bubblegum ban in Singapore is regarded as one of those dumb laws or arbitrary laws, but the actual history behind this bubblegum ban is very much so rooted in the history and culture of Singapore. And in my opinion, has some pretty good reasoning behind it. The origins of this ban date back to 1959. When Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, took office. Lee Kuan Yew is considered the founding father of modern-day Singapore, and it's said that his political leadership is what transformed post-independent Singapore into a highly developed country in the major global hub that it is today. Lee Kuan Yew was literally Prime Minister from 1959 until 1990. That is a major run as Prime Minister, but for 2 years before and after he was Prime Minister, he was also the Secretary General for the People's Action Party. To put it bluntly, this guy was invested in the success of Singapore. But I want to make it clear that I'm not necessarily advocating for Lee whatsoever. Like any politician or any person, there is both good and bad that must be recognized. And with any multi-decade-long run as Prime Minister, there's definitely some questionable things that go on. For example, from 1968 to 1981, Singapore, under the control of Lee, instated a one-party state. And because of this, he employed defamation laws and detention without trial, as well as other propaganda and social engineering techniques to continue his political success. So just keep that in mind. I'm not necessarily vouching for this guy. I'm just trying to unbiasedly state facts about the country. And two of the virtues that Lee held nearest and dearest to his heart was independence and cleanliness. And Lee has even gone on record to state that his goal when he became the Prime Minister of Singapore in 1965 was to, quote, create a first world oasis in a third world region. And he wanted to do so through hyper-independence and, of course, cleanliness. The gum ban specifically was introduced in 1992. It was done so for a plethora of pretty practical reasons. On top of Lee's personal desire to keep the country as clean as possible, chewing gum was actually becoming quite a bit of a nuisance within Singapore specifically. Gum wrappers were littering the streets, chewed gum was stuck on any surface you could imagine, and most notably in the late 1980s, when Singapore launched its Mass Rapid Transit or MTR subway system, vandals began to place chewing gum on the sensors of the train doors, causing them to not open or not close when they should have. And this vandalism at scale caused major subway delays, affecting the lives upon thousands and thousands of Singaporeans. And it was this stunt that broke the camel's back and officially led to the banning of chewing gum. But like everything else they've mentioned, it goes a bit deeper than that. Because this ban on chewing gum isn't just about banning minty fresh breath or keeping the subway system on time. Culturally, this ban signified Singapore's philosophy of having a strict government that enforces strong discipline. And the government saw this chewing gum vandalism as an act of rebellion from its citizens. And with the Singaporean government being as strict as it was and is, they decided that they were not going to play games and they wanted to ban it outright. But this ban was twofold, because sure, they wanted to show their civilians and the world that they ruled with an iron fist, but these acts of vandalism also gave them reason to keep the country that much cleaner. Something that a lot of people don't know is that while gum is banned in Singapore, it's not the only odd thing that's banned. Any form of litter is banned, any form of graffiti is banned, jaywalking is banned, spitting is banned, expelling mucus from your nose is banned, and urinating anywhere that is not a toilet is also banned. Oh, and if you use a public toilet, you are legally required to flush it. And while most of these things are not legal or accepted in other places, it just goes to show that with these specific legal bans, how serious Singapore is about public cleanliness and orderliness. And the chewing gum ban was only an addition of this already ongoing cultural movement. After this seemingly dumb and pretty arbitrary rule was put in place in 1992, many foreign journalists went specifically to Singapore to talk to Lee and question him about the seemingly seemingly nonsensical ban. And in every interview, Lee simply defended his point, claiming that you do not take a country from being a struggling country in a quote third world region to being a first world oasis without having strong rules, strong discipline, and ruling with an iron fist. Lee has even gone on record to state, quote, "We were called a nanny state, but the result is that we are today better behaved and we live in a more agreeable place than 30 years ago." And when one reporter tried to press Lee claiming that banning chewing gum could be banning the creativity of some individuals, Lee simply said, quote, "If you can't think because you can't chew, try a banana." I have no personal opinion on Lee or the country of Singapore, and I personally don't think I'd want to live in a country with such strict rules. Although it's hard to argue against the political career of Lee and the success that Singapore has had in such a short period of time as a result of some of these seemingly dumb rules. Serial killers in every time period. It's been said that war and violence are some of man's oldest pastimes. And if that's the case, I would say it's safe to assume that the serial killing apple doesn't fall far from the tree. With that being said, even if serial killing has been a humanity-long hobby for some twisted individuals, the morbid compulsion has definitely changed and evolved over time, which is why in this video, I'm going to discuss what serial killers were like in every time period. And also, in the time periods where it's possible, I'll be giving historical examples of some of the most notorious serial killers of that era. Let's begin. The Stone Age. The Stone Age is always a bit of a tricky time period to discuss, primarily for two reasons. For starters, the Stone Age consists of 3.4 million years of history. And secondly, none of that history is, well, recorded. Meaning that while there is a lot of history that happened in this time period, we have to basically infer everything from it through archaeological evidence, carbon dating, and my favorite, cave paintings. Now, just because the Stone Age is prehistoric, that doesn't mean that we don't have an idea of what life was like at the time. With that being said, with how limited our information on daily life about prehistoric people was, it's not hard to imagine how limited data was about serial killers in the Stone Age. And by limited, I mean essentially non-existent. Which is why for this time period, I'm going to do a bit of my own theorizing, combining historical fact about what life was like at the time and interjecting the traits that we commonly associate with serial killers in the modern day to essentially incubate a Stone Age serial killer. Now, just keep in mind that this is more or less of a trust me bro assumption rather than historical fact. Just to set the scene, the Stone Age was simple, very simple. Nearly everybody's day-to-day life was focused on food and survival. Most humans lived in small nomadic tribes, building small rudimentary shelters and crafting extremely basic stone tools. During the Stone Age, spending time with your friends and family wasn't just a pastime, it was a means of survival. And that's because during this time, everything was hard. And being a lone wolf was essentially a death sentence because no one individual could do every task required to sustain life. Every day, members of your tribes would be hunting for food, gathering water, collecting fruits and berries, and ultimately trying to identify the next location. Typically, these early human tribes were nomadic because they were following the migration patterns of animals, as well as seasonal weather changes. But of course, life wasn't just as simple as walking around and, smacking a few bugs. Because during the Stone Age, humans had natural predators, something we have not had for a very long time. And due to our lowered placement on the food chain in the Stone Age, living and existing in a tribe also granted you a lot of protection from different animal attacks. However, it wouldn't necessarily protect you from a serial killer. As we know from modern examples, almost every serial killer exhibits psychopathic behaviors. And how this typically shows is by an individual having a lack of empathy or remorse, or even impulse control. But on top of these individuals being just generally numb, they are also, for the most part, cold and removed, and in most cases, antisocial. A trait that'll be a bit tough to navigate with such a socially dependent time period. And of course, finally, one of the most common traits amongst all serial killers that have been documented is a pathological need for control. Something that, disturbingly, for most serial killers is the only thing that will satisfy their dark urges. But now that we have the context of what Stone Age life was like, and we also now have the generic avatar of a serial killer, let's now combine the two and create our very own Stone Age serial killer. And we'll call him the Stone Stabber. Let's say the Stone Stabber is a 25-year-old man living in a tribe of 10 people. During his younger years, the Stone Stabber exhibited traits that in a modern context would be concerning. However, in a Stone Age context were extremely beneficial, and those traits were excessive violence to animals. Typically, during the Stone Age, hunting was a part of day-to-day survival, and you ate what you killed, and you hunted when you needed to, because hunting was very expensive calorically, and sometimes hunting was not profitable, meaning you had to be strategic about where and when you hunted. But for the Stone Stabber, he didn't care. He wasn't killing because he wanted food, he was killing simply because he wanted to. And the result of this was him typically getting more food than he could possibly need and providing for his tribe more than anybody else. which is why he was quickly respected by those around him, because he was seen as a provider, and not yet seen as a psychopath. During the Stone Age, interpersonal relationships were simple to say the least, which is why his antisocial and psychopathic traits weren't necessarily red flags. Because at this time, communications were simple, and it wasn't necessarily uncommon for somebody to be sitting on their own a little bit outside of the tribe. And because the Stone Stabber was a respected member of the tribe, nobody questioned his coldness. However, as time went on, being a respected member of the tribe was not enough control or power for the Stone Stabber, and he could no longer control his urges. However, the Stone Stabber was smart. The Stone Stabber knew that his immediate tribe was simply too small to consider for his attacks, primarily because the chances of him getting caught were high, and also he would quickly run out of victims, which is why he would instead opt for using his rank in the tribe to influence where and when they would migrate, to ideally run into other human tribes where he could then execute his murders. During the Stone Age, it wasn't uncommon for different human tribes to encounter each other, and these experiences would range pretty drastically, from simply looking at each other, to getting freaky with each other, to even attacking each other. But in the case of the Stone Stabber, he would do his very best to interact with them by day and put on the most charismatic fake smile possible so that at night he could return to the separate human tribe and carry out his acts. Now, even though the Stone Stabber was interacting with a different human tribe, he still had to be sneaky for the reasons I described earlier, which is why when he arrived at the other tribe's camp at night, what he would try to do is lure one of the oldest or weakest looking members of the tribe away from the camp and away from the fire, suggesting he has something to show them, when in reality, he had much different plans. And in this case, once the Stone Stabber brought his victim far enough from the tribe, he would of course stab the victim with a stone tool, and using his excessive knowledge of hunting, he would not only effectively kill his victim, but also make it look like an animal attack. And by morning, when the tribe was looking for their lost member, it simply looked like one of their members got unlucky, and no one was the wiser. The Stone Stabber could continue this method seemingly endlessly if he never got caught. But as we know, most serial killers get caught eventually. Regardless, while, like I said, there is no recorded evidence of serial killers in the Stone Age, if there did happen to be somebody living in prehistoric times with the same cocktail of mental afflictions that causes one to become a serial killer, the story of the Stone Stabber is, in my opinion, one example of how a person like that could exist in the Stone Age. But I guess there's another very short example where somebody displaying antisocial behaviors is not given a high rank in their tribe, and for that reason, sent to live on their own, and in that case, they are quickly eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. But we're only just getting started, so let's move on to the next time period, the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age, in my opinion, is a major turning point in human history, primarily because it sets the foundation for modern civilization as we know it today. And that's not an overstatement. It's also where we truly begin to see exponential growth in regards to civilization and technology, although starting from humble beginnings. Now, just for context, in the Stone Age, it took humans millions of years to go from little guys hanging out in a cave to little guys hanging out in a cave with fire and sticks with rocks on them. However, in the Bronze Age, during its relatively brief existence of only 2,000 years, we see widespread and rapid development in both technology in the form of tools and weapons, urbanization, and even the invention of writing. And while just switching the rock on your stick to a piece of copper on your stick sounds simple, it can't be overstated exactly how significant the Bronze Age was in the context of human history. But with that now being understood, what did day-to-day life look like in the Bronze Age? One of the first things you'll notice is that people are just as stinky, but definitely more clothed. Loincloths have been swapped for tunics, and rocks on sticks have been swapped for copper spears. But besides the clothes on your back and the weapon in your hand, society also begins to look a lot different. Because with the introduction of this metal forging, we also now see the development of early settlements. People are living in bigger groups. Agriculture is being established. Animals are being kept and farmed. The wheel has been invented and is being used. And because of these advancements, life is getting slightly easier. Cave dwellings have now been swapped out for early huts, and the basic existence of hunter-gatherer tribes has now evolved into something that begins to resemble an early social hierarchy, including specialists, artisans, and farmers, all employed or employing other people. And as a result of this, early coinage as well. However, even though technology and society is beginning to now flourish in the Bronze Age, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, because for some malicious individuals, this development of society unintentionally allows depraved individuals to carry out horrific acts more easily. But first, even though the Bronze Age is a huge step up in technology, and there is some recorded evidence from the Bronze Age, historical accounts of serial killers from the Bronze Age are still few and far between. And I mean extremely few. Like, well, none. But in the context of the Bronze Age, it's not because there was no records, although documentation was extremely sparse due to limited records, surviving the sheer amount of time and turmoil from the Bronze Age to today. But even regardless of that fact, the way that records were taken and the subject matter of those records from the Bronze Age were simply completely different than the modern day. You see, today, if there is a serial killer, the media has absolutely no issue not only giving them the spotlight, but also giving them a cool nickname, in most cases unintentionally making them infamous, likely to the killer's satisfaction. However, in the Bronze Age, documentation was almost exclusively reserved for important matters, which at the time consisted of kings, wars, and laws, not necessarily individual criminals. Now, of course, that's not to say that violence wasn't a part of daily life in the Stone Age, because it definitely was in more ways than one. You know, war, ritual sacrifice, and just general conflict. However, the specific set of circumstances required to be a serial killer were simply hard to come by, and the term serial killer didn't even exist. However, just because there's no records of a serial killer in the Bronze Age, it doesn't mean we can't make our own. And similar to the Stone Age, we're going to combine the lifestyle of the era and the habits of a serial killer to see exactly how a serial killer would operate and exist in this specific time period. In this instance, let's call this twisted individual the Bronze Bludgeoner. And we'll say this individual is, once again, a 25-year-old man. Upon first thought, it might seem obvious that for somebody who is young, healthy, in a time period where warfare is emerging, it would make perfect sense for somebody with the bloodlust to join the army. However, for a serial killer, that sort of violence doesn't satisfy their dark urge for control, and it doesn't give them the unfair advantage they so desperately need to exist. Which is why, in this context, the Bronze Bludgeoner has taken up a job as a butcher at a local farm, and what he does after hours isn't much different. The settlement that the Bronze Bludgeoner lives in is large, roughly 600 people, and this settlement not only has established trade routes with other settlements, but also is fully self-sustaining. There is a nearby stream, there is early agriculture, early irrigation, metal gathering and forging, and even early trade. And because of this foundational economy existing in your city, you need to sustain yourself. Which is why the Bronze Bludgeoner figured he would monetize his violent tendencies and become one of the few local butchers. If you live in a small town, then you know that everybody knows everybody, and everybody is in everybody's business. And this Bronze Age settlement is no different. Growing up, the Bronze Bludgeoner was an odd child to say the least. Both of the Bronze Bludgeoner's parents were killed at an early age, leaving him with extreme emotional trauma and as an orphan. This experience for him was foundational, and the time he spent on the streets alone as an orphan truly hardened him and never allowed him to connect with anybody. As a young adult, he was able to survive off the kindness of strangers, although his violent tendencies among animals was prevalent. However, this wasn't noticed by the wrong person, and when one of the local farmers saw this young boy essentially mutating a rabbit, he didn't see a serial killer. He saw an orphan who needed a job, and he took him in, housed him, fed him, and unfortunately facilitated the development of a serial killer. Similar to the Stone Stabber, the Bronze Bludgeoner began to find his animal sacrifices unsatisfactory, and found his urges too strong. Which is where we begin to see a bit of differences in their stories, because for the Bronze Bludgeoner, he doesn't necessarily need to wait for other tribes to pass through, because while the settlement he lives in isn't massive, it's large enough to remove a person or two without getting caught. Working as a butcher in a high-volume part of the settlement, the Bludgeoner basically had all day to scope out potential victims. He would people watch not only customers, but anybody he could see walking around outside of the farm, and it didn't take him long to discover his first victim. Initially, the Bludgeoner thought he could victimize a traveler, someone who wasn't from the settlement he lived in, although he quickly learned that these travelers were traders, and they had value to their settlements back home and other settlements on their trade route, meaning that they would be looked for and missed. Which is why the Bludgeoner quickly set his sights on the elderly and vulnerable in his settlement. And because he knew quite a few people like this from his job, after work one night, he decided to pay one of his customers a visit. He covered his head with a cloak and wielded his fully bronze club. And only moments after entering the hut of this elderly widow, the Bludgeoner left with a body over his shoulder and a victim on his list. Now, even though the growth of society would potentially provide some cover in the hustle and bustle for serial killers to operate, the development of that society itself would also kind of equalize that new opportunity with advanced communication, advanced relationships, and even early law, making being a serial killer in this time period a rather complex task that could very easily result in death, exile, or some other form of punishment. And since during the Bronze Age, humans have more or less established their place as the top of the food chain, natural predators become a weaker and weaker excuse for these mysterious deaths. Meaning for that the Bronze Bludgeoner to continue their reign of terror, they would likely need to possess the unsettling charisma of some serial killers and psychopaths, as well as adopt a nomadic lifestyle to ensure they are consistently moving and not drawing too much attention. Because in the case of the Bronze Bludgeoner, everybody knows that he's a weirdo, and everybody knows that he has violent tendencies. So if somebody dies or disappears violently, it's not much of a mystery of who did it. But if you did want an example of somebody who caused a lot of death during the Bronze Age, one example would be Sargon of Akkad, the first ever ruler of the Akkadian Empire. Being the emperor of a nation that conducted many conquests, thousands of people died due to the orders of this individual. And while that doesn't personally qualify them as a serial killer, I figured they were worth at least mentioning because my goal is to insert as much actual historical knowledge as possible. But yeah, in the Bronze Age, while records existed, they were exclusively reserved for matters that were deemed important, and serial killers were not on that list. However, that isn't the case for this next era, the Iron Age. The technological and societal changes between the Bronze Age and Iron Age are way less dramatic than the changes between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. However, that doesn't make the Iron Age any less significant. During the Iron Age, we don't necessarily see the bloom of an entirely new way of life like we did in the Bronze Age. However, we do see a rapid expansion upon the way of life that was established in the previous era. And this expansion was of course defined by the new metal at play, of course being iron. And iron in the Iron Age, much like bronze in the Bronze Age, was a massive technological advancement that benefited society in seemingly countless ways, and still does to this day. If I had to summarize the difference between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age in one word, it would simply be scale. And that was because the availability and versatility of iron compared to bronze was night and day. And with this new, versatile, and readily available metal, tools were being forged and created like never before, allowing for a lot more settlements, a lot more jobs, a lot more farming, and a lot more killing. Of course, among other things. But like I mentioned, it was this scale that of course allowed civilization to expand and grow sustainably. Now, interestingly, one of the biggest differences in the Iron Age, at least in the context of this video, is that in the Iron Age we have our first ever historically recorded serial killer. Liu Pengli was born into the Han Dynasty in China in roughly 144 BCE. Being the grandson of Emperor Wen, he had an extremely privileged life. When Liu's father passed away, he inherited a large portion of his father's kingdom, a kingdom he also shared with his siblings. Some early records suggest that Liu was known to be a troublemaker, specifically surrounding himself with high-level criminals and warriors. But besides also just hanging with the bad boys, he personally was known to have a short temper and no impulse control, leading him to do some rather disgusting things. You see, at a glance, it might seem completely nonsensical for a prince to be spending time with criminals. Although it makes a lot more sense when you understand that these criminals were people that had violent tendencies who were actively hiding from the law. Louis, through his connections in the criminal system, would seek out these violent criminals and befriend them. And before long, he would recruit them, building his own private army. But the raids he would conduct with these criminals were not military at all. What he would do with these criminals that he essentially enslaved was the following. Louis and his roughly 20 to 30 man army would spend the nights going to random villages with the sole intention of robbing and killing innocent people. According to historical accounts, Louis and his men would do this so often that the total death toll among all of these raids was in the hundreds. And due to these raids being so brutal and so impossible to miss due to the literal army showing up in these villages, stories of these killings began to spread, and nearly every villager became terrified of leaving their home at night, in fear that this mysterious army may show up and kill them indiscriminately. However, little did they know, this army would be led by the ruler of the kingdom they resided in. However, with these acts being so bold and over time so common, it wasn't long before accusations were made. And eventually, a son of one of the victims made a direct accusation against Louis to the emperor and requested that the government had him executed immediately. Interestingly, these claims were taken seriously. However, as the trial was conducted, although death would have been a fitting punishment, the emperor did not allow Louis to be executed, and instead stripped him of all of his power, turning him from a prince to a commoner, and banished him to the countryside. And little is known about the rest of his life. The story of Louis Pengli is truly disturbing. It almost reminds me of like an opposite Batman, a nepo baby living a double life. However, instead of being a billionaire by day and fighting crime and helping society at night, Louis Pengli was likely a useless member of society during the day and an extremely violent tyrant serial killer by night, with his ragtag team of criminals. I can only imagine how terrifying it would be being a Chinese villager in a simple, quiet countryside, only to see an army of 30 men approaching at night, killing and robbing people indiscriminately in your village. The only potential twist in the story that I do have to mention is that it is speculated by some that Louis Pengli was set up by his uncle, who was the emperor. And the reason why he took these claims seriously from the simple villager wasn't because he was looking to seek justice, but because he wanted an excuse to strip the prince of power to reclaim more land. But unfortunately, that mystery is likely never going to be solved. And it's more commonly believed that Louis Pengli himself was the serial killer he was made out to be. Although, history is always written by the victors. The medieval era. For the sake of time, I'm going to keep the context portion short, but I will give a bit of context about the medieval era as a whole. To put it as simply as possible, cities, hierarchies, trade routes, and religions are established and enforced. Society is evolving and growing, and civilization is starting to resemble the one we know today. Economies, classes, and hierarchies are all in full effect. And I think for the most part, most people watching this video have a decent amount of context about what the medieval era was like. You know, castles, knights, kings, jesters, cool stuff like that. But on top of just those things, we also have the written word and historical accounts. And for the first time ever, we don't just have a little bit of information about a killer, we have a lot of information about a serial killer. So let's dive in. Gilles de Rais was a famous baron, lord, and war hero of 1400s France. He led the French army during the end of the 100-Year War and even accompanied Joan of Arc in battle at the time. Gilles was born in 1405. And similar to Pengli, was born into immense wealth and power. Gilles specifically was not only born into one of the wealthiest noble families in France, but also inherited almost everything at a young age due to both of his parents passing. Now being an extremely rich orphan, Gilles was taken in by his relatives and essentially given the spoiled brat treatment. However, the negative effects of his limitless lifestyle as a young boy didn't show in his early life. And as a young man, he was seen as a brave military commander, and a successful one at that. His bravery literally earned him the title of Marshal of France at an extremely young age. However, following Joan of Arc's execution, Gilles ended his military career and went from a public-facing war hero to a recluse who withdrew from any form of public life. He spent his days alone with only few people around him in one of his homes far away from any major settlements. And it was actually this retirement from his military career that seemingly sparked his new, disgusting, disturbing career. What Gilles decided to do in his castle was nothing short of evil. Between the years of 1432 and 1440, Gilles was accused of abducting, sexually assaulting, torturing, and murdering anywhere from 12 to over 100 young boys, primarily coming from poor families. These children typically entered the castle to beg for food or money, or were even lured into the castle with the promise of work, food, or money. And historical records show that Gilles would specifically subject his victims to extreme cruelty before killing them, for the specific purpose of his personal gratification. Literally the textbook definition of a serial killer. Fortunately, after his nearly 8-year reign of terror, his actions had earned him the attention of both secular and church authorities after numerous parents reported their children going missing after entering Gilles' residence. And it was because of this attention that Gilles was arrested in 1440. He was tried, he confessed to his crimes, and he was convicted of murder, heresy, and sodomy. And later that year was executed by hanging and burning. The story of Gilles de Rais, at least in my opinion, has a more satisfying ending than the story of Liu Pengli. However, they both have similar origins. They both were born into extreme wealth, they both had military exposure and seemingly limitless power, and they both decided to use their resources for pure evil. In the case of Gilles, at least justice was eventually served, and he did at least confess, giving us historical proof of this serial killer existing and committing these horrific crimes. However, in my opinion, I would have preferred he would have just never done this in the first place than give us this historical account of pure evil. Now, I think it's important to note that while with the two sections that we have historical data for, we see a very obvious trend that these serial killers are both high-ranking Nepo babies, it's also important to note that the reason that these serial killers are likely documented is because of their status. Because if the traditions from the Bronze Age hold true, one-off criminals were not worthy of having records written about them. And for that reason, there was likely many serial killers doing similar things during the medieval era, and likely the Iron Age too. However, there is no records to discuss it. But at least at that time, there were records of powerful people doing evil things, which people in the modern day could take a few notes from. But regardless, if you want an example of a serial killer from the medieval era, de Rais is a perfect example. He was born into extreme wealth and power, had an extremely successful military career, and in his retirement found his pleasure in some of the most horrific actions imaginable. The early modern era. The early modern era is one of the shortest time periods in this entire list, and it really only spans for 300 years, from roughly 1500 AD to 1800 AD. But of course, during that time, significant global changes took place, most notably world exploration and scientific pursuits. And while both of those did end up leading to countless deaths during its time, we do actually have another recorded serial killer from this time period. And this one is definitely a doozy. Elizabeth Bathory was a noblewoman from Hungary, and a member of the powerful House of Bathory, which was essentially an extremely powerful and rich family that owned land in the Kingdom of Hungary. Elizabeth lived from 1560 AD to 1640 AD. And while she was a very fortunate, rich, and high-profile individual, she found herself choosing to do some of the most depraved things imaginable. For context, Elizabeth Bathory is literally known as the Blood Countess. And this is because at the age of 30, Elizabeth started to recruit more and more servants for her castle, but she didn't use them for regular chores. What she would do instead is torture and kill them, and after they were dead, she would collect their blood and allegedly bathe in it, which is ironic given her name is literally Bathory. Regardless, it's been reported that from the years of 1590 to 1610, Elizabeth victimized anywhere from 80 to 650 servant girls in her castle, specifically with the intentions of using her blood to preserve her youth. After her nearly 20-year reign of torture and murder, some of her more brave servants put her on trial, and she was actually convicted of 80 counts of murder. And while on trial, there was over 300 different testimonies given about the depraved acts of Elizabeth. And for that reason, she was sentenced not to death, but to life in prison in her castle, which in my opinion seems like a light sentence. However, she did die only 4 years into her prison sentence in her home in her sleep. Not necessarily the satisfying ending, although it did end her reign of terror. And with that, we are left with one final time period, the modern era. Fortunately, I don't need to give a ton of context on what the modern era is like, because, well, we're living in it now. And while technically the modern era stretches from roughly 1800 to today, most of the known serial killers from the modern era have primarily come from the 1970s, which really isn't that long ago in a historical context. Especially in a video where we started by talking about the Stone Age. Now, if you're watching this video, I'm assuming you're a bit of a true crime buff, or at least somebody who has a morbid curiosity about history and things that are potentially off the beaten path. And I'm assuming for that reason, you're pretty familiar with examples of serial killers in the modern day. And while you already know what the modern day is like, and I've already described the profile of a serial killer in the modern context, I figured why not mention at least a few notorious examples of serial killers from the modern day, just to tick that box. Some famous examples from the beginning of the modern era would include H.H. Holmes, who is considered potentially the first American serial killer ever, and of course, Jack the Ripper. But more modern examples would include Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Ed Gein, and the list goes on, unfortunately. The craziest revenge stories in human history. The year is 1860, and it was a crisp October evening in Hartford, Connecticut. A young, loving couple sat beside their fire in their relatively modest shack, anxiously awaiting the delivery of their new baby boy. And while these soon-to-be parents would be overjoyed to have a baby that is nothing more than happy, healthy, and ordinary, little did they know the son that they were just about to have would not only be extraordinary, but would literally become something of legend. And after hours of torturous labor, this legend was born, with the official birthday of October 26th, 1860, and the legal name of Frank Boardman Eaton. Although it was the alias he was given later in life that would become his globally recognized name. Frank was a normal and happy child. He enjoyed playing with his friends, he enjoyed time outside, and he particularly enjoyed spending quality time with his father, at least as much as he could get. At the age of 8, Frank and his family moved from Hartford, Connecticut down to Twin Mound, Kansas. And this move, unfortunately, was a turning point in Frank's life. Shortly after Frank and his family moved to Kansas, it was obvious they did not fit in. Frank's father was an abolitionist, although the city they moved to had a pretty strong Confederate population. And during this time, those two did not get along at all. Now, while Frank was initially upset about the move, he quickly made new friends in Kansas, and it almost seemed like his new home. Although, for Frank's parents, it was somewhat obvious that trouble was brewing. Although, they kept their fears away from Frank. That was until they couldn't anymore. Not even 1 year after moving to Kansas, Frank's father was shot dead in cold blood by 6 former Confederate soldiers. These former soldiers were part of a vigilante Southerners group who called themselves the Regulators, and they believed it was totally acceptable to use violence on your political enemies. The news of his father passing devastated both Frank and his mother. Frank's mother was concerned about how she would make ends meet and how she would take care of her boy on her own. And Frank had no idea what life would be like without his best friend. After the murder, many members of the community went to visit their new neighbors and pay their condolences. But it was one man who visited the family that left a particular impact on Frank. This man was named Moses Beeman. He was a friend of Frank's father, and he had one important message for Frank. During his visit, he took Frank in a separate room, sat him down, looked him dead in the eye, and told him the following. "My boy, may an old man's curse rest upon you if you do not try to avenge your father." He said nothing else to the 8-year-old child. He hugged his mother, and he left the house, leaving Frank with a heavy heart and a confused mind. The following week, Moses returned, although he didn't have an order. This time, he had an objective. He took Frank into the backyard, set up some cans on a fence post, and pulled out a gun. At this point, Frank had seen guns but was not familiar, and was more or less traumatized by the thought of handling a gun due to how his late father died. Although Moses ensured it was okay and safe, and the two began to shoot. And from the age of 8 to 15, Frank, both with Moses and by himself, took shooting very seriously, and very quickly gained expert levels of marksmanship with no formal training. At the age of 15, Frank decided that it was time to get formal training. He, although being young in modern standards, felt like a man at the time. He had been taking care of his mother for years now, and he felt like the time was right. Frank set out to visit Fort Gibson in Oklahoma. Although when Frank arrived at the fort, he was quickly turned away, being told he was too young to join the army. Feeling like it was too late to turn back, Frank felt desperate. And it was at that moment that he looked the colonel dead in the eyes and told him, "I know I can't join the army yet, but I just need to learn how to shoot. Please, even for a day, take me in. For all you know, I might even be a better shot than some of your soldiers." And while the colonel saw this as disrespect, he also saw this as a challenge, and he took Frank in to humble him. During his time in the fort, Frank reportedly outshot everybody in the fort, and even kept up with the top marksmen in the army. Frank stayed for much longer than he anticipated and participated in many shooting competitions at the fort. So many, in fact, that the commanding officer and that same colonel, John J. Coppener, gave Frank a marksmanship badge and also gave him the now legendary nickname of Pistol Pete. After spending years practicing at home and now having the affirmation of the government for being an extremely skilled marksman, Frank felt emboldened to act on the mission he was given as an 8-year-old boy. Remembering what Moses told him in the hours Moses spent with him, he knew what he had to do. And over the next decade, Frank hunted down and killed every single one of his father's murderers, except for one, who unfortunately passed away before Frank could get to him. After seemingly accomplishing his mission, Frank felt proud and once again lost, and he ended up settling in Oklahoma and decided to use his skills for good and became a sheriff and later a blacksmith. And he also went on to become married, have 9 kids, 31 grandkids, and even live long enough to see 3 of his great-great-grandchildren. Frank, or Pistol Pete, passed away on April 8th, 1958, at the ripe age of 97. And while he has been gone for decades now, his story is definitely still around. And in my opinion, it's one of the coolest revenge stories of human history. But we're also just getting started. I don't know, I really wanted to start the story with Pistol Pete because I thought the story was so cool. You know, almost like a Batman vibe. Like, he was literally given the task as an 8-year-old boy, hey, you have to kill everybody who killed your father or you will be cursed. Like, that's a crazy thing to say to an 8-year-old, but he did it. He took it seriously, he learned marksmanship, he avenged his father, and then used his skills for good. But on top of just being a legend for that, Frank was also a legend for being very personable. And he was so personable and outgoing, in fact, that him riding a horse at a parade in 1923 is the reason why Oklahoma State University has the mascot of Pistol Pete. Students of what would later become Oklahoma State University literally saw Frank on a horse, being Frank and just doing outrageous things and being outgoing, and decided that this guy is the perfect representation of our school. And for that reason, they petitioned to change the mascot, and well, the rest is history. Because it wouldn't be until 1958 that a caricature of Frank known as Pistol Pete would become the official mascot. And the now iconic logo was not even a licensed symbol until the 1980s, obviously long after Frank passed away. Since Frank's passing, he has won multiple awards. Most notably, in 1997, he was inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, and in 2022, he was inducted into the Hall of Great Westerners at the National Cowboy Western Heritage Center in Oklahoma. And literally only last year, in 2025, he was also inducted into the Oklahoma State University Hall of Fame, further proving that Pistol Pete is a legend. And in Oklahoma, he is very much so appreciated. Frank had a normal upbringing, but because of unfortunate circumstances outside of his control, his father was taken from him and he was given a mission he would go on to fulfill and then live a long, prosperous life. Honestly, that's how you make lemonade out of lemons. But we're only just getting started and we have more stories to get into. The year is 963. Harold Bluetooth, the King of Denmark, and his wife were both awaiting the delivery of their son. Although this time, they weren't in a modest shack. They were in a quite luxurious castle. After hours of grueling labor and beating all odds, the queen survived, and the baby boy was born happy and healthy. And his name was Sweyn Forkbeard. Growing up as the son of the King of Denmark, Sweyn had a much different upbringing than most Danes. Sweyn was born into one of the most iconic bloodlines in all of Viking history, and it was for this reason that he had massive shoes to fill. Fortunately, due to his unique upbringing, he was exposed to knowledge and education that most Danes could never dream of, and it was this experience in his early life that set him up for success as a strong leader. Without having really any recorded facts of the upbringing of Sweyn, there's not much to report about his early life, besides the fact that it is very likely that he was exposed to warfare, strategy, and swordsmanship at a very young age, and this was proven later in life. As Sweyn began to develop from a young boy to a young man, he began to have more and more tension with his father, or at least his father figure, because it is believed that Harold Bluetooth is likely not the biological father of Sweyn, but more likely the stepfather, with the biological father being Harold's brother who passed away before Sweyn was ever born, marrying his brother's widow and taking on the child as his own. That, on a surface level, seems admirable, although, as we will go on to learn, this decision was likely his downfall. As Sweyn grew from a young boy to a young man, he felt he was ready to take on responsibility, and Sweyn approached his father, asking him for a piece of Denmark, something that he could own and rule and practice his kingsmanship in, although Bluetooth denied the request, and Sweyn took this rejection as an act of war. Sweyn quickly decided that he only had one option if he truly wanted to gain power, and that was to take it. And shortly after this denial, he began gathering an army, telling Bluetooth that he was going to go on a raid at some point. However, in reality, the swords he was collecting were going to be pointed at his father. Now, the reason why Sweyn went to such extreme lengths to betray his father are debated, although it's not believed that he tried to overthrow his father simply just because he was denied land. It is believed that it was the combination of this land denial on top of another factor that caused, well, such a violent overthrowing, which we will discuss. Those two additional factors that are debated, well, are the following. Some believe that it was around this time where Sweyn found out that Bluetooth was not his true biological father, therefore emboldening him to overthrow Bluetooth because he was the true heir to the throne, not Bluetooth. And the other belief is that Sweyn simply did not like the Christianization of Denmark, and that's because Bluetooth was the first king of Denmark to be baptized and accept Christianity as the primary religion, something that rubbed Sweyn the wrong way, because he held the pagan Viking traditions and beliefs closely to his heart, and this Christianization seemed like a betrayal. Unfortunately, we may never know what the true reasons were. Regardless, a large-scale battle took place. Bluetooth's army actually won the battle. However, Bluetooth sustained a massive injury during the battle and died shortly after. And because of this, Sweyn was now made the king of Denmark, supposedly at the age of 23. During Sweyn's time as the king of Denmark, he was involved in multiple large-scale historic battles, each of which are worthy of a video on their own. But to summarize the next few decades, Sweyn used his might and strategy to take over significant parts of Norway, so much in fact that he actually became the king of Norway as well in the year 1999, and then set his sights on England. However, the English were not so happy to have the Danes on their land. And it was because of the English's disdain for the Danes in England that the King of England at the time, King Alfred the Unready, ordered the massacre and mass murder of all of the Danes in England. This event was known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, and it took place in November of 1002. This massacre was undoubtedly tragic for the Danes in England and their families back home. And one of the most notable individuals impacted by this massacre was Sweyn Forkbeard, because both his brother and sister were murdered in this massacre. And it was these exact murders that gave Sweyn the motivation and justification to let all hell break loose on England. And that he did. Sweyn was already occupying parts of England because of the prospect of revenue. Although now with this newfound justification, they wanted not just parts of England, they wanted to rule the entire country. And from the year 1002 to the year 1012, Sweyn engaged in 3 different full-scale battles on England. And by the end of the following year, 1013, Sweyn became the official king of England by means of conquest, making him the king of a 3rd consecutive country, the king of Denmark, the king of Norway, and now the king of England. And with the conquest of this final country, he was able to enact his revenge. Because although the king of England took a brother and a sister from Sweyn Forkbeard, Sweyn took the crown and the country from the king of England, something he likely planned on doing anyway. Although with this added motivation, I'm sure it made the revenge that much sweeter. The full detailed story of Sweyn Forkbeard is obviously something I can't go into in this video. Although I'm really hoping this brief summary gave a pretty good overlook on how one man could lose some siblings, but gain a country. Now, I'm definitely not going to say Sweyn seemed like an innocent, harmless individual. He was a ruthless ruler, and it appears he partook and engaged in some of the very much so common brutality of his day. Although, when a king decides it's acceptable to exterminate an entire group of people, there needs to be pushback. Unfortunately, the King of England just happened to mess with the wrong Viking. Now, I would be lying if I didn't tell the full story, because shortly after taking the crown in England, Sweyn did die. And he died, unfortunately, only 40 days after becoming the King of England, giving him only limited time to enjoy everything he had worked for. It's like they say, is it better to have loved and lost, or never loved at all? In my opinion, the story of Sweyn Forkbeard is so interesting. And the fact that he was the king of 3 countries at once, to me, is mind-blowing. And sure, the guy, overthrew his dad, or stepdad, we don't really know. But when somebody kills your brother and sister, either in-law or by blood, taking that individual's crown and country in retaliation seems like pretty sweet revenge. And yet, there's still more to discuss. The year is 1783. 2 new American immigrants had just given birth to their baby boy in Pennsylvania. And I don't know why baby boy is such a cliche in this video. I did not intend this. Regardless, 2 Irish-Scottish immigrants had just given birth to their baby boy. His name was Hugh, and he was about to become, once again, a legend. Hugh's early life is not necessarily well known, although he is extremely famous for what happened near the end of his life. In his early life, Hugh set out to become an explorer, and on one of his expeditions, he was essentially enslaved by pirates when his ship was overtaken by pirates, and he was given the ultimatum of either dying or becoming a pirate and fighting with them. He chose life and unfortunately spent multiple years as a pirate doing pirate things. On one of his missions, Hugh decided to ditch his pirate crew and spend time with some of the Native Americans that he had met in Texas. Now, he wasn't intentionally trying to be in Texas, the pirates were simply here, and he decided to just jump ship. Interestingly, the Native Americans that he had met were not fans of pirates whatsoever, and for this reason, he was sentenced to death almost immediately when meeting these natives. It has been reported that right before his execution by the natives, Hugh was able to offer these natives an expensive dye that they could use to dye garments and for war paints, and this was enough to spare his life. And because of this transaction, he was able to not only live, but spend the next couple of years living amongst this tribe, a time when he was able to hone in his skills as a hunter and outdoorsman. After Hugh spent multiple years as a pirate and then multiple years as a tribesman, Hugh decided it was time for something new. And it was at this time that he left the group of natives he was living with and decided to travel to St. Louis, Missouri in 1821. At this point, Hugh had been on this earth for nearly 40 years and had lived a full life for many up until this point. Although it was this move that he made to St. Louis that would truly cement Hugh Glass as a legend, at least in terms of revenge stories. The following year, after moving to St. Louis, Missouri, Hugh noticed an advertisement in the newspaper, the Missouri Gazette. The advertisement was commissioned by William Henry Ashley, and the advertisement was calling for 100 men to ascend the river Missouri as part of a fur trading venture. And to Hugh, somebody who's lived a rather storied life up until this point, this career opportunity not only sounded exciting, but also seemed like something that was directly within his skill set. And so he decided to respond to the advertisement and get the job. Him and 99 other men, of course. The group of men that ended up getting hired for this position became known as Ashley's 100, which, if you ask me, kind of sounds like another crazy OnlyFans challenge, but we'll put that to the side. These Ashley's 100 were some of the most rugged and skilled mountain men that Missouri had to offer. And once the group was fully organized, the following year, they had started their expedition. An expedition that would be longer and harder than Glass could ever imagine. The expedition was almost instantly met with resistance from Native Americans. It was reported that the Americans tried to initiate trade, but were met with violence, which resulted in an all-out war against this native settlement and, well, these traveling traders. The result of this conflict was the entire village being burned down, everyone dying on the native side, and a vast majority of the Ashley 100 dying as well. Following this all-out war on the tribe, Hugh and 13 other men continued their journey to the Yellowstone River, where they intended to trap and fur beavers. To me, that fact alone is crazy, that they literally had a full-scale war during this expedition, and they, just continued to get beaver pelts of all things. Regardless, it wouldn't be this all-out war with the native tribes that would be the source of revenge. That betrayal and revenge would actually come from within the Ashley 100. Once Hugh and the 13 other men finally arrived in Yellowstone, the men split up and began looking for furs. And that was when Hugh stumbled upon an ominously quiet clearing right outside of a small creek. And this area, unfortunately, turned out to be a bear's nest and resulted in Hugh Glass being mauled by a bear severely. This angry, aggressive mother bear threw him to the ground and then pinned him down as she bit into Hugh, threw chunks of his meat to her cubs, and then her cubs also began to attack Hugh as well. To call this bear attack brutal is an understatement, and by the time that his fellow hunters and trappers were able to kill the bears, Hugh was essentially a shell of a man and wasn't even believed to be alive. Although, shockingly, upon further inspection, Hugh was breathing and somehow still alive. Although, just because he was alive now didn't mean he would be alive for long. And because of this, the other men put Hugh on a stretcher and began carrying him, assuming that they would carry him for the day, set up camp, sleep, and in the morning he would be dead and they could bury him. Although, after a day of carrying him, and then after sleeping through the night and finding him still alive, the group decided that it didn't make sense to carry him all the way home, because he obviously wouldn't survive. And the group decided to move on, but they did leave 2 people to watch over Hugh's body so that they could give him a proper burial once he did pass away. These 2 men, Fitzgerald, an older man, and Bridger, a younger boy, only a teen, both watched over Hugh for 5 consecutive days. And shockingly, Hugh survived every single one of those days. Although, to his team members, this was not a miracle. This was a liability, because these men were still in the middle of the wilderness, and they knew that they had bears and also angry native tribes on their tail. And these men were growing more anxious by the day. And it was on that 5th day that these men decided that they had to abandon Hugh. And that they did. They took his gun and everything of value off his person besides his clothes and left him to die by a creek. However, Hugh didn't die. And what he did next made him the legend that we likely are all familiar with today. And if you've seen the movie The Revenant, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Following being abandoned, Hugh surprisingly was able to come to and regained some form of consciousness, although his body was simply not cooperating. He had multiple broken ribs, a broken arm, a broken leg, and was truly in horrendous shape. However, he did have enough strength to drink water out of the stream, eat berries off of bushes, and gather enough nutrition to sustain himself. And with berries in his belly, he came to terms with the fact that he had been abandoned by his team. And with this realization, he became enraged. So enraged, in fact, that he decided that he would make it back to his camp and confront those men that abandoned him at any cost. And with that, he began the multiple 100-mile trek, starting with just crawling and eventually being able to hobble and walk the entirety of the way. After somehow surviving and maneuvering over 240 miles, Hugh reached a fur trading outpost where he was able to hitch a boat ride back to his original camp. And this was fortunate, because this boat ride alone was an additional 300 miles, something that he likely would not have survived on foot. Regardless, after this boat ride, Hugh and the French fur traders he was with were attacked by another Native American tribe, although they were also defended by a separate Native American tribe. And the result of this all-out conflict was the death of everybody in Hugh's camp except for himself. And these Native Americans that saved his life and fought on his behalf, once again, delivered him directly to a separate trading post where he was offered the opportunity to rest, but he did not take it because he had not yet achieved his goal of getting his revenge. Now, mind you, this was 6 months after the bear attack at this point. Everybody who had ever known Hugh would have likely believed he was dead. Although, little did they know, Hugh was very much so alive, and the 2 men that abandoned him were about to get an earful, to say the least. Shortly after this encounter, Hugh finally made it to Fort Henry, the fort where his original company was supposed to be. And it was there where Hugh ran into Bridger, one of the 2 men that abandoned him. Although Bridger was not a man, he was a boy. And after Hugh talked to Bridger, he came to the conclusion that Bridger was a bystander. He was simply only following orders and did not intentionally betray Hugh. And because of this, after a harsh winter, Hugh decided to once again continue his journey to find Fitzgerald. He joined another mission to go 400 miles upstream to a new trading post where Fitzgerald was supposed to be, and he was well on his way to get his revenge. Although, once this boat had landed, it was once again attacked by another group of Native Americans. Most of his group died, and Hugh was once again left, I'm not even joking, to his own devices, where he was injured, alone, and had to walk hundreds of miles. After nearly a year of pain, torture, suffering, and, well, anger, Hugh was finally able to run into Fitzgerald at a settlement known as Fort Atkinson. However, at this fort, it was revealed that Fitzgerald had joined the United States Army. And if Hugh wanted to get revenge on Fitzgerald, it would be a death sentence, because killing a soldier was a crime punishable by execution. Although, I don't think Hugh needed to kill Fitzgerald to get his point across, because I'm sure for Fitzgerald, even seeing Hugh would have been shocking. But beyond just making making his presence and, well, being alive known to Fitzgerald, Hugh also told Fitzgerald that while he can't kill him now, if he ever leaves the army, he will personally kill Fitzgerald. And while to some that may not sound like the most satisfying revenge, being able to come face to face to the man who abandoned you and not kill him, but to tell him, hey, I'm alive, I survived everything, and I'm not going to kill you. A, because I can't, but B, because you might have worse things coming to you. And while death is a harsh punishment, war is no walk in the park. And I would personally like to believe that being able to overcome and survive everything that Hugh did, coming face to face with the person that abandoned him and telling him off, and being the bigger man was likely the most satisfying thing he could have done in that situation. But for all I know, he could also have just been extremely mad that he was a soldier and was avidly waiting for him to, not be a soldier anymore so he could get his real revenge. But I'll leave that for you guys to decide in the comments. Regardless, hopefully this extremely oversimplified version of the story of Hugh Glass paints just a small picture of how much of a badass he truly was. And if you want to learn more about it, watch the movie The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio. Or if you want a more accurate depiction, read some historical documents. This guy went to hell and back multiple times and could never truly catch a break. Although he was able to survive seemingly the impossible, and he was able to come face to face with the man who left him for dead and tell him that he survived the impossible and that it was Fitzgerald's turn to survive war. Ancient traditions we still do for no reason. You and your best bro are sitting at a train station waiting on a bench for your train to come. You both have been so excited about the trip you're about to embark on, and you both are surprisingly feeling rather inquisitive today. And it's that inquisitiveness that's actually going to make today's journey rather insightful. As you both are beginning to get bored, you realize that you do have some time to kill before the train will arrive, and you decide to stroll around the city center while you wait. Almost immediately upon exiting the train station, you notice a beautiful fountain. This fountain is massive, historic, and has multiple water features, just making it look so cool. And interestingly, as you approach it, you notice that the entire bottom of this well is filled with coins, and you actively see people throwing coins into this well as you are looking at it. Obviously, not wanting to miss out on some good fortune, you decide to throw a coin of your own. And it's almost instantly after this coin leaves your hand that you begin to question, wait, why am I even doing this? Surely there's an explanation for people throwing currency into water features. However, luckily for you, your friend has a book on ancient traditions. And this book, admittedly, is going to do some heavy lifting today. And as your friend opens this book to tell you the answer to your question, he finds the specific page, and it's really quite interesting. You see, the tradition of tossing coins into a fountain doesn't date back 10 years or 100 years, it dates back thousands of years. And the reason why we do it is literally an ancient belief that, well, just kind of stuck. The most commonly agreed upon explanation of this tradition actually dates back to Roman, British, and Celtic mythology. And the part of that mythology that most pertains to this, well, tradition is the fact that if you were out in the wild and happened to stumble upon some sort of fresh water source, such as a spring or creek or lake, you were literally blessed by a water deity who had just granted you good fortune and good health in the form of random clean drinking water. Now, obviously, because you have been given such a massive and random gift by the water deities, the only natural thing to do in return is, of course, repay them, which is where the monetary offering comes into place. It was commonplace at this time to literally leave money or gold in fresh water sources to repay nature and thank it for its offering, which is partially wholesome because it's such a deep gratitude for nature, but also kind of ironic because you're finding a clean water source and then instantly contaminating it, at least if you're using, well, dirty coins, specifically ones stored in your prison wallet. Regardless, while this tradition is obviously interesting, there are other similar practices that actually predate coinage altogether. And many much older cultures that had similar beliefs about water deities would leave offerings such as food, special stones, carved artifacts, and even herbs in exchange and in gratitude of natural water sources that they also found. Now, interestingly, as time went on and beliefs changed and the religions evolved, the tradition itself stayed the same. However, the reasoning behind it simply took on a new meaning. During the Roman era, for example, travelers would typically throw coins into fountains right before a journey, using it as an offering for safe passage or success on their trip. And while that specific belief still definitely exists on the modern day, I would argue that for the most part, people that are throwing coins into wells in the big 2026 are usually just doing so for a bit of fun and potentially some good luck as well. And while in the modern day this tradition may seem like it's all fun and games, there was a time not too long ago where this tradition literally seemed like life or death. After getting this insightful history lesson from your bro, you now feel both informed and positive because you have just unintentionally blessed the journey you and your friend were about to go on. And while the explanation that your friend had just given you was interesting, it was also lengthy, and the train was about to arrive any moment. As you and your friend rush to get onto your train, you sit down in your seats and begin to relax, thinking about the fun day you have ahead of you once you arrive in your location. But because you know you're stuck on this train for at least the next few hours, you decide to take out your laptop and get some work done. When of course, your mind notices another outdated tradition. As you open your laptop and wait for it to turn on, you look down at your keyboard and ask yourself, wait, why is every single keyboard laid out this way? Like, who decided to put A, S, D, F beside each other? And what the heck is a QWERTY? Wouldn't it just make more sense if the keyboard was A to Z? And while you continue to ponder this on your own, your friend is already flipping to the right page in the history book to see the ancient origin of this strange tradition. And he explains that the reason why keyboards are laid out the way they are date back all the way to the 1870s, which obviously isn't ancient, but I figured it was old enough to put on this list. In the 1870s, obviously people were not creating keyboard layouts for computers. They were creating layouts for mechanical typewriters. And interestingly and intuitively, early typewriter prototypes actually had the alphabet laid out in A to Z formatting. But very quickly, people were running into one major issue. Letters that were commonly used consecutively would get stuck together on the typewriter. And with a keyboard that goes from A to Z, some common combinations were of course EF, AB, ST, NO, and DE. And because of all of these common letter combinations being right beside each other in the keyboard, as I mentioned, A, they were getting stuck together, and B, the arms of the mechanical typewriter were actually striking each other, essentially jamming the machine, making it either temporarily inoperable or, in some better cases, just damaging it slightly. Regardless, they learned pretty quickly that A to Z was not sustainable for early keyboards, which is why they needed to make a new mechanical keyboard layout, and this job was completed by Christopher Scholz. Christopher's solution to this issue was to separate letters that were commonly used pairs to intentionally slow down typists and reduce the overlap in letters being used consecutively. That alone is kind of hilarious because in the 1870s, typists had to be nerfed because typists were literally so good and fast at typing that they were breaking the machines. Imagine how annoying that would be, being so good at typing that you were typing so fast the machine would break that you then had to replace that machine with a completely new layout. Like, I personally got a new Razer keyboard that has a whole new 6 buttons at the very left side of the keyboard, and that messed me up for weeks because every time I wanted to hit escape, I was actually hitting M6, and every time I thought I was hitting S, I was hitting A. Regardless, that small change was annoying, and I couldn't imagine experiencing an entirely new keyboard layout. And it's actually, ironically, this reason alone that we still use the QWERTY keyboard layout to this very day. Obviously, modern day keyboards and computers have no issues with keys getting stuck or mechanical arms striking each other. And theoretically speaking, we could totally switch over to a number of different layouts, and there are actually other ones that do exist. However, the reason why the QWERTY layout is still the standard of the world to this very day, and likely will be forever, is simply because once it was established as the industry standard for typewriters, the format, the scale set, and the habit all sort of transitioned into other technological devices. And at this point now, even though the reasoning for this layout is completely redundant, it would be way more trouble than it's worth to try to introduce a new layout, even though it's, well, kind of obsolete at this point. So yeah, even though over 100 years ago, there was a very good reason to be using the QWERTY layout on a keyboard, in the modern day, the reason why we still use this format is more so tradition than efficiency. As your friend begins to close the history book after telling you all of this interesting information, you see a plume of dust blow out of the book as he slams it shut. And of course, the first thing your friend does is sneeze, the body's natural reaction to, well, pollutants in the nostrils. And while your friend sneezes aggressively on this train, you respond to his sneeze without even thinking about it. And you tell him, bless you. But before your friend could even wipe off the snot he launched on the seat back in front of him, you ask him to open the book again, because you're curious why we even say bless you in the first place. Obviously, this has to have some sort of ancient origin, and you need to get to the bottom of it. And luckily for you, your friend obliges, and he explains the following. The tradition of saying bless you after somebody sneezes is one of the oldest recorded traditions that exists from ancient times that is still extremely prevalent in the modern day. And I would argue that most of the people that say bless you do it to be kind and polite. However, they have no idea what the origin of what they're saying even means. But don't worry, you're watching Trust Me Bro, and you're gonna learn. Some people claim that the origin of saying bless you after somebody sneezes dates back to the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks, who were believed to have seen sneezing as a divine sign. In some cases as a good sign, but in most cases a bad sign. And this bad sign was typically interpreted as your soul literally leaving your body, or as you being attacked by some sort of unseen demon. In the case of your soul leaving your body, it was believed that during a sneeze, your soul would at least temporarily leave your body, and for that reason, it was vulnerable to be taken by Satan, which is why anybody with an earshot who had heard your sneeze would bless you to protect your soul from being stolen by the devil. And in the case of being attacked by a demon, some believed that sneezing was a form of you removing evil spirits from your body. And in this case, bystanders would say bless you simply to help you further remove these evil spirits. I don't know about you, but both of these to me are extremely interesting because something that is now seen as a polite thing to say was literally a casual form of exorcism in ancient times. In any instance, people would say bless you literally as a form of blessing you or protecting you from this divine or supernatural experience that could potentially be negative. And even if it were positive, they were simply affirming your positive divine experience. Besides the Roman and Greek origins of the phrase, there's also another origin that dates back all the way to medieval Europe, specifically around the bubonic plague. During the bubonic plague, one of the earliest warning signs, at least that was believed at the time, was sneezing. And it was for this reason that anytime somebody heard somebody sneezing, they would offer them a blessing, as they knew that the next time they would see this person, they likely wouldn't be alive. Regardless of which origin you subscribe to, the fact that we still do this in the modern day, to me at least, is interesting. Because I would argue that basically nobody in the modern day are helping people expel demons or wishing them a safe passage to the afterlife when they say bless you after hearing a sneeze. And while the tradition is still popular in the modern day, it really has no practical purpose besides being polite. But I do think the history is interesting and, well, there's nothing wrong with being polite, so while there's no reason for this tradition, I don't mind it being around. Oh, and if you're curious about the meaning behind Gesundheit, you know, those weirdos that say Gesundheit after you sneeze, well, that actually stems from the German language, because the word Gesundheit is actually somewhat borrowing the German words for health or good health. And this tradition is actually more so modern, taking place in the 20th century. And while it doesn't have the divine roots, it does have the same core message of wishing you good health. But yeah, I honestly don't know who says Gesundheit. If you do, comment below and unsubscribe. As your friend begins to close the book, for a second time, another plume of dust shoots up his nose and he sneezes once again, further covering the seat back in front of him with his green goo. And because of this, you both go silent, trying to figure out how you're gonna clean up all this snot. But in your silence and pondering, you hear the people in front of you speaking. And fortunately, they're not speaking about your snot. They're speaking about natural disasters of all things. You decide to listen in. And one thing you notice is that every hurricane they mention has a name. And while in the modern day this is commonplace, your inquisitive mind can't help but ask, what is the ancient origin of naming storms after people, specifically women, for a very long time? And while you don't see this out loud, the inquisitive look on your face and you slowly pointing at the book is enough of a hint for your friend to open the book and find the ancient origin of the tradition of naming storms. And while he is still in no condition to read, he leans the book towards you and it reads the following. The tradition of naming storms dates all the way back to the 1800s. And while it once again isn't ancient, I think it's old enough. Regardless, during the 1800s, specifically in countries and islands that saw a ton of hurricane activity, decided to start naming these tropical storms after saints, specifically saints that had days dedicated to them. And how they would associate these names to these storms is whichever saint's day was closest to the day of the storm would have their name given to the storm as well. So for example, on July 26, 1925, the hurricane was called Hurricane Santa Ana, and so on and so forth. But while this tradition was happening in smaller island nations, it wasn't commonplace globally yet. And in most places of the world that didn't see tropical storms very often, how they would identify storms is simply by addressing them by the longitude and latitude that they were currently at. Now, the only problem with this was that A, it was kind of confusing for regular people because most people are not familiar with the longitude or latitude they live at, and also if somebody was trying to track multiple storms, it would be a plethora of numbers they would have to memorize and try to decipher rather than just remembering a name, something most people are pretty good with already. In the early 1900s, the tradition of giving storms non-numerical names started to gain popularity, although these names were always retrospective, specifically naming storms after locations that they destroyed. Although giving a storm a name after the fact doesn't help save any lives. And it was for this reason that in the 1950s in the United States, meteorologists began giving storms names in alphabetical order. However, these names were not human names, they were military names, such as Bravo, Echo, words like that. Although that naming structure actually only existed for 3 years, until in 1953 when meteorologists officially began naming hurricanes after women. That's right, they began using human names, but only female human names, of course going in alphabetical order. Now, if you have a keen eye, you would notice that, well, in the modern day, storms are named after men, and I'm curious if you know, what year did they begin naming storms after men as well? If you said 1979, you'd be right. which means that for 26 years, storms were named exclusively after women, which to me just seems illogical. And I'm curious if they added men's names to be fair or just because they were running out of names. Regardless, the sexism in that is an entirely different ancient tradition that we're not discussing in this video. With the introductions of human names, there has also been an introduction of retiring names if the storm was catastrophic enough, meaning that there are some human names that storms will never have again, like Katrina, for example. But yeah, the tradition of naming storms isn't necessarily ancient, although it has a very interesting history in my opinion. And while naming storms after the longitude and latitude in my opinion is way too overcomplicated, I feel like giving them human names is almost a bit too simple as well. And I feel like there's possibly a middle ground of names that sound scientific but are also easy to understand and communicate. Like, for example, like some sort of code. Like, look at German cars. C63 AMG, M340i, not a real M car, A8, Porsche 911 GTS. All relatively simple and scientific sounding naming structures that aren't, well, giving storms human personas. This kind of reminds me of the media giving like serial killers unintentionally really cool names. Like, it's not helping anything. And I feel like if you're a kid in school and let's say that Hurricane Luke is coming to town, if you're a kid in school and your name is Luke, you are going to get picked on for the next while. And every time there's an update in the news, everybody's saying, oh, Luke's coming to town, look what Luke did. And as a kid, that's probably going to be pretty annoying. Regardless, you've now got to the bottom of another outdated tradition. As you and your friend complete reading this section of the book, your friend closes the book and you both sit and reflect. And you really can't help yourself but say, wow, I truly am grateful to live in a place that doesn't have hurricanes. Sure, we might have snow and high taxes, but I mean, no hurricanes is a big plus. And while your friend is agreeing with you, he actually remembers that he has an upcoming trip to Florida. And because of this, he says, hopefully a hurricane doesn't hit when I'm in Florida next month. And immediately after he says that, he knocks on the closest piece of wood he can find, obviously ensuring that he didn't just bring negativity onto his trip. But almost instantly after knocking on the wood, your friend sees the look in your eyes and knows that you're inquisitive on why do people knock on wood after they say something that could be unfortunate. And before you can say anything, he's already opening the book, looking for an explanation. And what he reveals is the following. Interestingly, people knocking on wood is extremely similar to people throwing coins into natural springs. In both of these instances, individuals are believing that they are interacting with spirits and actively bringing good fortune and blessings onto themselves. However, the way that knocking on wood works is just a bit different. The origin of the wood knocking tradition is believed to date back to Celtic or German folklore, and it's believed within this folklore that benevolent, supernatural beings live in trees. You know, fairies, sprites, and just general positive spirits. It was because of this belief that fortunate and positive spirits were living in trees that people began to form the tradition of touching trees or knocking on trees specifically to wake up the spirits and request good luck from them. This touching or knocking could also be a sign of gratitude, thanking them for good fortune that you've experienced, which of course rings similar to the first section where people would put an offering into a natural spring to show gratitude or to request good fortune. Now, interestingly, the belief that trees are sacred or full of positive spirits isn't necessarily exclusive to German or Celtic mythology, and this belief has actually existed throughout almost all of time in basically every culture. Trees, in my opinion, are really cool, and almost every ancient and modern culture has recognized that in one way or another. And knocking on wood is simply one example of that has, I guess, evolved and transformed over time. And while most people who still knock on wood for good luck don't necessarily know why they're doing it, and they're definitely not praying to spirits within the wood, they are displaying a bit of belief and a bit of superstition, which go to show the strength of beliefs and the importance of traditions within history. So yeah, even though knocking on wood just seems like a funny thing to do so you don't jinx yourself, the ancient origins of this tradition are a lot less silly and a lot more serious. And they might make you look at trees just a little bit differently. But with all of the talking that you and your friend have been doing, day has turned to night on this train ride, and you see one of the train employees approaching you with the beverage cart. You and your friend both take an adult beverage, and before either of you dare take a sip from your glasses, you delicately touch the two glasses together and then proceed to drink. Luckily, at this point in the train ride, your friend already knows the drill. And fortunately, this time he doesn't even need to consult the book because he knows why we do this. And after he takes a firm gulp of his drink, he tells you the following. There's actually a few really interesting reasons why people would cheers their drink. One of the most popular explanations why people would clink their glasses or cheers in ancient times is because they wanted to make sure that their drink was not poisoned. It's believed that people would cheers their drinks with so much force that the liquid would literally spill out of the cups and kind of just, cross-contaminate drinks with each other. But this was strategic to ensure that if your drink was poisoned and your guest witnessed your drink go into their drink, if they were hesitant to have their drink, then you could kind of know your drink was poisoned. This was definitely some ancient 5D chess. Although with poisonings being rather common in ancient times, this isn't necessarily an unbelievable explanation and does make sense. Although it isn't the only reason why people would cheers in previous times. And another common reason why people would cheers glasses in ancient times is to ward off evil spirits. It was believed by some cultures that the loud noise of the glasses hitting each other were loud enough to scare away evil spirits. And this practice was kind of linked to church bells as well, which I think also makes sense. But regardless, obviously this tradition of warding off evil spirits and sharing poison still exists, but its meaning is completely different. And in the modern day, people cheers simply to show a sign of unity and respect. Although, if you ever believe your drink is poisoned, well, just make sure you cheers really hard. But considering most of the glasses that people use today are bought from Temu, well, if you try doing an aggressive cheers, you're just gonna spill drink on the table and have glass shards in your hand. So instead, if you really want to protect yourself from poison and express some unity and good cheer, subscribe to the channel. We currently have over 1.1 million bros, and we're on the road to 2 million bros. And we have a strict no poisoning policy here, meaning that you're safe to subscribe and enjoy great videos every single Friday, just like this. And if you want more videos like this one, leave a like or leave a comment below saying part 2 so that I know you want more videos about ancient traditions that we still do today. And with this, let's continue to the final few traditions of this video. As you and your friend are finishing your drinks and beginning to relax, you notice the train employee coming back to collect your glasses. But you realize they're not empty-handed. They're actually holding a birthday cake. Now, obviously, you're shocked because it's not your birthday whatsoever, although your friend has a look in his face that he told the train it was your birthday, A, to embarrass you, and B, to get a free cake. And after the train staff finish singing happy birthday, you two are both left with a cake and one candle on it. But before you can even blow out this candle, your inquisitive mind gets the best of you. And your friend, once again, refers to the book. And this one is mind-blowing. The tradition of putting candles on a cake and blowing them out actually dates back thousands of years to the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks would bake round cakes in honor of Artemis, the goddess of the moon. But not only would they bake these cakes in honor of the moon, but they would place candles on top of the cake to replicate the moon's signature glow. Once again, further honoring the moon. After the ancient Greeks had created their own edible moon replica, they would then make wishes that they believed the smoke from the candles were lifting to the moon god in hopes that the moon god would answer their prayers and make their dreams come true. Over time, the tradition of baking cakes, putting candles on them, and allowing the smoke from the candles to rise was associated with different celebrations and eventually became associated with birthdays. And from there, the tradition of allowing the candles to burn turned into blowing the candles out to further allow the smoke to rise and, of course, make your wish come true. And while in the modern day, I would imagine that basically nobody is trying to have their wishes granted by the moon god Artemis, the fact that this tradition still remains nearly untouched from its ancient traditional form, in my opinion, is at least very interesting and gives you a fun fact to share at every birthday party you go to. And it's kind of funny to just imagine somebody, praying to the moon god and offering them a cake, only for somebody to walk up and be like, oh, can we do this tomorrow? Tomorrow's my birthday, and we can pray together, and then we can eat the cake. Right. Like, it's just over time, people just took this opportunity of praying to gods and creating cakes as offerings to being like, actually, this is about me now. But yeah, that's why we blow out candles. Not because we all want to be amateur firefighters, but because thousands of years ago, people wanted the moon to grant their wishes. And while you and your friend complete this cake you received based off of lies, you feel tired and sluggish after the day of travel and the massive sugar intake. And for that reason, you decide to close your eyes and take a nap before your train gets to your destination. Completing the story for at least this video. If you're anything like me, you grew up playing Call of Duty, and one Call of Duty that always stood out specifically was Call of Duty World at War. This game was undoubtedly the catalyst for my fascination with the Second World War, and recently while doing one of my late night History Channel binges, I came across some really interesting weapons. So in this video, I put together a list of some of the weirdest and most obscure weapons from World War II. Oh, and these are going to start weird, but get even weirder. First up, we have the Krummlauf, which is a German invention. The Krummlauf itself is not a weapon, but it is a weapon modifier. The Krummlauf is a barrel extension for rifles, similar to a suppressor, although this one was curved with a 30-degree angle. Although it seems like something out of Looney Tunes, the purpose was quite ingenious. The Krummlauf was used for close quarters combats in urban situations, specifically shooting around corners and over trenches. The Krummlauf wasn't typically blind fired, as it also had a periscope attached to it to also see around the corners. As useful as this item may appear, it wasn't extremely practical because it had a few major downsides, mainly accuracy and durability. The periscope, typically fastened with the Krumlauf, was very susceptible to fogging up, which left huge room for inaccuracy, and the Krumlauf itself was very susceptible to the immense forces behind a bullet, not only controlling the bullet, but also redirecting that bullet, and they typically were only good for a maximum of 300 shots. Personally, I think the look of the Krumlauf is one of the weirdest things about it. I think the idea isn't bad, it's just wasn't able to be executed properly. The Krumlauf is weird, but there's definitely weirder, which is why it's only the first entry on this list. Next up, we have the V3 Supergun, and super it is. The V3 Supergun was developed as a so-called vengeance weapon in order to strike back at London as Allied bomber fleets pounded German cities to rubble. The V3 cannon was capable of delivering a 140 kilogram shell at a range of over 161 kilometers. But big deal, right? Wow, a cannon that could shoot a little bit further. What's so special? Well, one of the most unique attributes about the V3 Supergun is how it achieved this enormous range, and its unique engineering. The secret to this enormous range and what made this gun truly special was a number of side channels attached to the 140 meter long barrel. These channels were filled with additional propellant which would be triggered by the shell as it traveled through the long barrel. Essentially what would happen is the shell would trigger the propellant as it would fly down the barrel, which would cause the propellant to explode, giving even more velocity. The long barrel with these channels would essentially allow the shell to be fired multiple times without even leaving the barrel. The best analogy I can think of is when you're playing Mario Kart and you drive on a speed boost. That's basically what's happening inside the barrel. To me, the engineering behind this concept is really interesting, but the weirdest part is definitely the fact that the barrel was literally almost 500 feet long. Despite all the research, development, and resources that were put into this weapon, it wasn't really able to be executed properly. During some demo tests, it wasn't able to meet its hypothetical potential, and before they were able to truly implement it, they were destroyed by the Allied forces bombing and destroying the gun. Later, smaller variants were used on bombing raids against Luxembourg, but that's not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about, however, is something the Russians did that I don't like at all. And you're not going to like it either. That being anti-tank dogs. Yeah, this one is exactly how it sounds, unfortunately. The Russians were strapping bombs to dogs for them to detonate under tanks. How they do this? Well, in training, they would starve these dogs and then hide food under stationary tanks so the dogs would know to look under tanks for food. They would then bring these same dogs to the battlefield with bombs strapped on their backs. The idea was that the dog would run under an enemy tank and then the bomb on its back would explode. Besides this being extremely primitive and brutal, this technique was also extremely ineffective. On the battlefield, these dogs were extremely scared of these tanks charging towards them, and combined with enemy fire, they wanted nothing to do with these enemy tanks. Also, some of these dogs would go back towards Russian tanks, hiding below them, causing friendly fire. Overall, this method is completely horrible and honestly not great. This technique is pretty on point for Russian military exercises, as their whole mentality is essentially throw bodies at something until the problem's solved. But anyway, staying on trend with explosive animals, we have our next entry, which is explosive rats. This one is interesting because it was a failure that actually turned into a pretty massive success. The British military weapons design team was looking for interesting ways to infiltrate the German infrastructure. Obviously, they were getting desperate because where they landed was explosive rats. This differs from the explosive dogs because these rats were no longer alive. The rats were found, killed, skinned, and essentially taxidermied but filled with a plastic explosive. These rats would be planted in and around coal storages on German bases with the intention of having them be thrown in the incinerator and boilers, triggering the explosive and causing a massive explosion. Now, here's where things get interesting. The Germans early on caught on to these explosive rats, and the British, because of this, stopped producing them. But Germany didn't know that, and because of that, the Germans were extremely paranoid about more explosive rats and spent a lot of resources and man-hours strictly checking rats, dead and alive, on all of their military bases. Despite the fact that the rats were more effective than the dogs, and I would say arguably less upsetting, I wouldn't say that this method is much better. For our third and final animal-based entry on the list, we have pigeon-guided missiles. Yep, you heard me right. pigeon-guided missiles. But unfortunately, it's not as cool as it sounds. The birds that your grandma likes to throw bread at isn't also a double agent. Their primitive brains were just used for tracking, which is still pretty interesting. B.F. Skinner was a psychologist and a passionate pigeon trainer who believed that pigeons could be useful weapons of war. He was ultimately able to prove his theory right, as he was able to teach pigeons how to recognize targets and aim weapons accordingly. The pigeons had specially designed cockpits inside of these missiles which allowed them to peck their way to pick the direction they wanted the missile to go, pecking up, down, left, or right to control the missile accordingly. It's strange and insane to think that pigeons can be trained to literally guide missiles, but it's also kind of unfortunate that these birds were unintentional kamikazes. What was intentional, however, was our next entry, the Japanese Fugu balloon bomb. These bombs were extremely primitive in nature, being constructed solely out of paper. These paper bombs were huge, 33 feet in diameter for the most part, and could lift up to 1,000 pounds, but all they were lifting were 33-pound anti-personnel fragmentation bombs. The Japanese released these bombs into the Pacific jet stream, which would silently carry these large devices from Japan to the US without any pilot, and the trip would take several days. Despite releasing thousands of these devices, the balloon bomb was extremely ineffective, not to mention resource intensive. It took up to 30 minutes to an hour to prepare one balloon and required 30 hands on deck to create one. During the war, there was only 6 casualties reported from the balloon. A minister's wife and 5 Sunday school children were on a fishing trip encountered the balloon near Oregon, and sadly they fell victim to it. Although for this weapon to be considered successful, it would mean the death of people, which is obviously unfortunate. It is kind of laughable how ineffective this weapon was, considering all the time and energy that went into it. Finally, we have the last entry of this list, the Pajantrum. The Pajantrum never saw combat, but for reasons we'll get into, was a fan favorite amongst civilians. The best way to describe the Pajantrum is a British-made rocket-powered wagon wheel battering ram, if that makes sense. To find a way to breach Germans' concrete defenses in Normandy, the British military devised a large carriage-like contraption called the Pajantrum. The device was propelled by rockets attached along the rim on the outside of the wheel, and in the middle there was a drum full of explosives. The goal was to have the Pajantrum speed towards the wall and break through it and eventually explode. The concept sounds simple enough and honestly kind of makes sense if you don't really think about it, but the biggest problem facing the Pajantrum was the fact that there are so many technical inconsistencies and issues. Rockets blowing off, the wheel going in the wrong direction, not generating enough force to penetrate the concrete wall. Although the general public enjoyed watching the live demonstrations of the Pajantrum, it was never brought to battle due to all of the technical inconsistencies of it. Besides the fact that all of these weapons were complete and utter failures, they all have one thing in common. They are weird. And they sucked. But let me know, which one is your favorite or least favorite? For me, the dog method was the worst by far.